Hey, sovereign wealth builders, Simon Dixon here, and welcome to another episode of Simon Dixon Hard Talk. It has been an absolutely wild week. I can't even put the days together with the news flow that is happening right now. And so I was up pretty much every single night doing interviews. Now that the Epstein files have pretty much confirmed everything that we've been teaching, or I've been sharing, or I've been using as a follow the money strategy in order to project macro geopolitics and understand what the technology that is being built right now. And it's really, an emotional roller coaster at the moment. And so what we're going to dive into is, now that we know what has been released in the Epstein files, and now that we know all the things that I would have been ridiculed for or called a conspiracy theorist for have been confirmed that that's how power works, I want to make sure that we deconstruct everything on the Bitcoin side, on the macro side, and on the geopolitical side. And I'll also be doing that by playing a couple of interviews that I've done this week and deconstructing it and breaking it down. Right. So firstly, for those of you that didn't leverage your Bitcoin, because I was screaming for as long as I could that at some point, the price of Bitcoin, now that the financial industrial complex has created the derivative industrial complex around Bitcoin, they want to steal your Bitcoin. And you need to look back at every single video if you want, because I was screaming out. And I remember when I was debating people and they were saying, oh, the financial institutions, it's a mature asset now. The OG Bitcoiners, they need to step aside. And the adults are taking over now. And it's just going to be a steady, mature asset. And I was like, The financial industrial complex are the real market manipulators. Now the real money comes to steal your Bitcoin. And all you need to do is not fall for their tricks. And so if you were listening to those people, they'd be like, well, this is a mature asset right now. Why don't you custody your asset with Coinbase? It's a public company. It's very reputable. Or why don't you, screw Bitcoin? Why don't you just buy a Bitcoin ETF instead? And why don't you take out some fiat currency loan against your Bitcoin? It's JP Morgan. Jamie Dimon's here. He's very reputable. And Jamie Dimon and JP Morgan, it's regulated by the Federal Reserve and the regulators. The same Federal Reserve that's about to be regime changed, and they're about to put a Jeffrey Epstein mentioned Fed chair in. And the same SEC that was headed up by Gary Gensler, who was also communicating with Jeffrey Epstein, that was appointed by the same Trump, that was also deeply involved in history with Jeffrey Epstein. These reputable people. And yes, that JP Morgan, the one that settled $285 million for its money laundering activities for Jeffrey Epstein. Why don't we trust them? And then we can borrow against our Bitcoin and we can get some fiat currency and they can steal it because they're good players, because they're the adults that are taking over. They're the ones that created this crash. And I said, I've seen my Bitcoin crash from $30 to $3. I've seen my Bitcoin crash from $20,000 to $3,000. I've seen my Bitcoin crash from $70,000 to $15,000. And now everybody is experiencing, depending on how new they are, $125,000 Bitcoin crash to about $65,000. And if you're new to this, it can be a little bit scary. But if you have psychologically learned how to price your value in Bitcoin and in gold, then you're saying, hell yeah, this is the opportunity of a lifetime. I've been given some 50% on sale Bitcoin that I get to accumulate this month. Thank you, financial institutions. While Michael Saylor is loading up with debt and centralizing as much Bitcoin as possible, and everybody is bowing down to Michael Saylor, and then everyone's copying his business model because the other person mentioned in the Epstein files, Howard Lutnick, who lied about the fact that he was only disgusted by Jeffrey Epstein. And him and his wife went round the house to his neighbor and said, "Ew, I'm getting out of here," while simultaneously arranging different meetings and talking about how they wanted to bring their children over to meet Jeffrey Epstein. All in the files. And what did Howard Lutnick do? Howard Lutnick was setting up all these Bitcoin treasury companies, going around to all the different people, like old school Bitcoiners, like Adam Back, who also was allegedly organizing a meeting with Jeffrey Epstein. And, of course, X was filled with people that were saying, what happened to my Bitcoin that I had at Strike and that I had a loan against it? And what happened to the share price of all those Bitcoin treasury companies that now are between me and my Bitcoin? I don't have any Bitcoin. I got all this fiat currency. I don't have any Bitcoin. I got this IOU share that's worth 95% less than what I bought it for. I've got some fiat currency debt and no Bitcoin. What happened to the Bitcoin? They took your Bitcoin because that's what they do. And of course, everyone else that had it in self-custody was saying, chill. And they were busting the people that were the bad actors that were lying about their interactions with Jeffrey Epstein. And they were getting this opportunity to own more Bitcoin and become more sovereign. While the rest of the world was saying Jeffrey Epstein created Bitcoin. Well, we're going to bust that stupid myth. While Jeffrey Epstein in 2018 bought Bitcoin for dummies in his Amazon.com receipts in his emails. But anyway, we're going to be doing a couple of things today. Sit back, relax. You're not going to need to listen to many other people. The information flow is impossible to keep up with right now. And we haven't even started. But remember, your job was to own more Bitcoin this month than the previous month. It was to boycott the Federal Reserve. It was to own it in self-custody and boycott BlackRock. It was to not borrow against it, so you boycott the banks. It was to invest in decentralized technology so that you're not contributing to centralization. And it was to spend local, focus on you, your family, and your community so that you can be more sovereign, so that you can build companies that don't have to bow down to the Silicon Valley pedophiles, and you don't have to take your company public so you're subordinate to the investment banking pedophiles, and you can be more sovereign in your company and actually serve community, create real value, rather than bowing down and contributing to the proof of weapons network that is glued together by crimes against humanity. Confirmation of everything we've been talking about. ISIS, Al-Qaeda, Western assets. Jeffrey Epstein would talk about that. They talk about the Vatican Bank. Remember where he said all that drug dealing and all that human trafficking and sex trafficking, where the Vatican gets a little kickback? Jeffrey Epstein was talking about that too. What about the Zionists being an outpost for the military-industrial complex? What about the purging of Zionism? Remember what I said? To get to a multipolar world, they're going to have to purge Zionism. Jeffrey Epstein, this was the purge. They're going to have to engage in exposing the system that strategically weakens the dollar. The financial industrial complex are leveraging the military industrial complex. And of course, they're only going to show what is needed to strategically weaken the dollar, transition to a multipolar world, and purge the assets that are now turned into liabilities. But the power structure continues. The proof of weapons network is recollaborating based upon this multipolar world order. And of course, you're not going to get what the real Epstein files, which is what's happening in court right now between Bank of New York Mellon, that is refusing to hand over the financial transactions and the suspicious activity report. That's the real Epstein files. That's where we find out whose money and we follow the money. But of course, that's not going to be released because that would send the whole network down. And this is just a purging of some of the assets that are now liabilities and making sure that all power is on check to what the proof of weapons network is meant to be doing. And so enjoy the reputation damage from some of the sick people that have been compromised into this network and understand how the world really works. Forget this amateur, media-funded, divide and conquer, technocratic, Orwellian nightmare that crypto capital is trying to build at the moment. Forget about the stupid media that's trying to say it's the Muslims, it's the Jews, it's the blacks, we're the white nationalists, it's all these different divide and conquer, it's the Democrats, it's the Republicans. The whole system is rotten to the core. And now you know what your dollar's backed by. And now you know what the next fiat currencies are backed by as well. Because the world is transitioning to this multipolar world. And so what I want to do in this episode is I would like to share with you and a recap many of the things that my listeners and long-term listeners will be very familiar with. And it's pretty interesting. I always said to you, every time I do these things, I get called all sorts of names in the beginning. I get violently opposed. I get hate. I get all sorts of stuff. And then slowly but surely, they all drop off. And 2 years later, they were like, maybe there's something to that thing. It's kind of been a theme of my life for a very long time, ever since I set on this mission to figure out how the financial and monetary system actually worked. And not just by theory, but by actually going out there and trying to create a bank, by working in the investment bank, the trading side, the stockbroking side, the investment banking side. When I share how deals are structured, I'm sharing based upon real experience. And then being involved in trying to change the system in multiple countries, whether it be UK, whether it be Isle of Man, whether it be El Salvador, engaging with politicians, understanding how power dynamics work. Investing, not just, finding out about Bitcoin and alternative financial systems, investing in the companies that built the sector, seeing the companies that I invested in later become part of the proof of weapons network and controlled and subordinated into the financial industrial complex through blackmail operations like Jeffrey Epstein. And don't think that Jeffrey Epstein is the only one here. He was a liability. He's no longer an asset, and there's many more. This is how the system is glued together. This is not exposing the system other than resetting the order right now. This is the global reset. And by global reset, it means everything we've been talking about in terms of power dynamics, transnational capital, China building the manufacturing base, fueling the sovereign wealth funds, and partnering with the US-hosted financial industrial complex that will own the Western Hemisphere while the covert operations are purged that propped up the dollar, and all the death, destruction, rape, pillage, violence, covert operations that propped up the dollar get exposed. And you have the destabilizing militias that are no longer going to be sponsored by state as we transition to this multipolar world. All of that is happening right now as we speak, and we will keep following the money. Now, the first thing I wanted to do is I'm going to do two things today. I did an interview with Suleiman Ahmed, and he interviewed me on Jeffrey Epstein and Bitcoin. And the reason I want to share this one is because he's not a Bitcoiner. he came at it from asking the questions that everyday normal people will be asking. And I answered them, and I shared stories from my experience of what was confirmed in the Jeffrey Epstein files and things that I believe are happening. They may be not exactly how it happens, but we connect the dots. It's a really sensitive topic because there are several people that I believe people should really be looking into. And none of them are in prison. They're all getting away with things. And we should be holding them to account, and we should learn from this, and we should give them the opportunity to come out and put the record straight as well. Now, there were several people that I really targeted in this video and in this interview. One of them was Adam Back, and he's come out and responded to half of it, but that was before the interview, so we haven't seen anything since the interview. All we've seen him do is shill stablecoins, shill strategy, shill treasury companies, and this whole quote-unquote ex-cypherpunk that went to allegedly Epstein Island that took money in his company that allegedly was divested through Blockstream. He hasn't talked about, this cypherpunk guy. Suddenly he's shilling stable coins, treasury companies, borrow against your Bitcoin, buy Bitcoin via the stock market. So let's see. Let's get the answers. The other one I talked about was Brock Pierce, some of the covert operations. We haven't heard anything from Brock Pierce yet. And I do want to give an update on somebody that I talked about. And I think all I want to do is tell you my experience, which I did, and some of the things we've seen. And I got a detail inaccurate that I think I should correct the record for right now because Amir Taki messaged me. And all I can do is I don't know how to verify any of this stuff because I don't have access to financial transactions or anything. But I can just share what he told me. He said that that his co-founder through one of the companies at his project, and you can go check on his profile, came back and killed the deal. So he said that he didn't receive any money from Jeffrey Epstein. The other thing he said as well was, I think I framed it a little bit inaccurately in the interview. He went to Syria to fight ISIS, which I think is actually a very honorable thing, because we know that ISIS is a CIA, Mossad-backed organization. And he went and fought on the front line and risked his life. And he shared how 100 of his colleagues, were taken out while he was fighting. And I believe that is a very amazing and noble activity. But the comments that I shared where he was on the Bitcoin talk forum, and he said he gave a price to 16-year-old and 18-year-olds and various other things. He claimed that was a joke. It was in bad taste, and it's something that he will be punished for. And he said that it was a joke. That was his. Now you decide. Amir Taki did a lot for Bitcoin in the early days, I think I just wanted to put that straight, so that when you actually watch the interview, I think I framed it a little bit one-sided. I have no opinion on what is true, what isn't true. I can't vouch for anything. My whole point in being sovereign is just to share what I believe to be true and try and accurately represent it. And sometimes I get that wrong. My job is not to ruin people's reputation. My job is to shed light on things, and then people can explain it. And then I'll share what they share, and we'll find out over time what is the truth. And so I just wanted to make that correction before we go into the first interview. Right, this is going to be, as I said, buckle up. We're going to have a bit of a long one today. The first interview was Suleiman Ahmed interviewing me this week, a couple of days ago, on what do we know about Jeffrey Epstein and what it was revealed about the characters involved in Bitcoin, and all the crazy allegations that were made that really probably contributed to a part of the price correction. But I think it was a psyop by the financial industrial complex to margin call people out, as I was predicting would happen, so that they can scoop up as much of your Bitcoin as possible, because you're using their paper Bitcoin products instead of real Bitcoin in self-custody. And the second interview was I gave an update on all the big macroeconomic trends, the crashes in the markets, what it means, how to interpret it, how it relates to the Epstein files, as well as an update on what may be the imminent next stage of the military operation between US, Israel, and Iran, and what I'm expecting to come next as a result of everything that happened this week. So without further ado, Azad, shall we jump into the first interview where we're going to be discussing Bitcoin and the Epstein file release?
I just want to welcome Simon Dixon to the show, the expert on all things Bitcoin, the financial industrial complex, and how money flows and impacts geopolitics. His favorite line is follow the money. Appreciate, Simon, you coming onto the show. I really want to hear your thoughts about Bitcoin and the connection with Epstein. How are you doing?
All good. Yeah, I mean, it's a wild time right now. You know, this is the unmasking phase of everything. And so, yeah, it's a pretty crazy time. So just trying to apply some of my 25 years of finance to helping us figure out what some of these crazy things that are happening in the world are. So let's jump in.
Let's do it. Let's do it. Okay. So the Epstein files have been released, and I know you've been speaking a lot about it. You've been an early adopter of Bitcoin. There are certain things in the file which speak about Bitcoin, speak about Epstein's investments. And so let's take one thing at a time. What did you find in the files which may suggest Epstein funding the early adoption of Bitcoin? The early kind of founders of Bitcoin or the developers of Bitcoin being on the Epstein list. And then we'll also talk about the possibility of Epstein being Satoshi Nakamoto.
Yeah, sure. So, look, it's such a nuanced subject that people's, desire to get an attention grabbing headline means that pretty much everyone's getting it wrong. Look, I'll start with the fact that I've been involved in Bitcoin since it was $3, 2011, invested in 100 different companies, know the inside track of lots of this stuff, seen people go from purist to off the rails, and seen infiltration and compromise all along the way. There's not a lot I haven't seen, made every mistake, distanced myself from people when I need to, been connected with people who have disappointed me. So, everything that I'm sharing is kind of from firsthand experience. If I believed that Bitcoin was a Mossad op, was supporting crimes against humanity in Israel, and was propped up by, or was, a creation of pedophiles and various other things. I'd sell all my Bitcoin, I'd buy gold, and I'd tell everyone why I sold Bitcoin. I'm at that stage in life. So what did we learn from the Epstein files? Firstly, we learned that Jeffrey Epstein, who's a compromise agent, whose job is to compromise all levels of power in order to utilize those connections, use degeneracy and, heinous crimes to make sure that it props up a power network of people that, kind of props up power. So that's what we know about Jeffrey Epstein. So Bitcoin was created as a white paper in 2008. The first line of code was in 2009. The very first developer outside of, the first miner was Hal Finney and Satoshi Nakamoto, who I suspect I know who they are. But we still don't have full confirmation. Um, and then you had a bunch of developers that joined an open source project. One of the first developers that I ever met that introduced me to the project via a connection from the monetary reform movement was a guy called Amir Taki. Now, Amir Taki was the first person that I noticed whose name was, you can search for Amir Taki in the files. And that was around 2011 when Jeffrey Epstein was trying to, based upon the emails, assuming they're all real, was trying to figure out who to connect with within the Bitcoin community. And Amir Taki was one of the developers at the time. This is 2 years after, the very early implementations of the code. And so if we're to believe these emails, it's confirmation that Jeffrey Epstein wasn't Satoshi. But Jeffrey Epstein was trying to figure out who he should connect with. And I think his goal was to compromise as many people and figure out what this was all about. Now, I know from firsthand experience that this was around the time that Amir Taki was looking at creating alternatives to Bitcoin. And he was involved in a project called Darkcoin and Dark Wallet, which wanted to take the properties of Bitcoin and make it more private. That project later got rebranded to Dash, and it's still a cryptocurrency that exists today. So the way I interpret this is that Jeffrey Epstein initially was trying to figure out who everyone was. And then the first developer that we've got confirmation that he made contact with and tried to send some funding to was Amir Taki, who was involved in privacy coins and taking implementations of Bitcoin and trying to make it more private so that no one could trace the transactions.
So that's one person that was in the files, right? He was in the files. He communicated with Jeffrey Epstein, I believe. Jeffrey Epstein asked for his contact, I believe, in 2011. And later, there is clear evidence that he not only communicated with him and maybe had a lot of engagement with him, correct?
Yeah. And look, Amir Taki is a crazy guy. Like I've had various interactions with him over time. Firstly, he invited me to speak at the first Bitcoin conference in Prague. He is an anarchist. He was one of the very early faces of Bitcoin, Gavin Andreessen and Amir Taki. And people used to go to squats in Old Street where he would clearly be on drugs, talking about how Bitcoin is freedom and people can use it to buy whatever they want. And so, this is an anarchist deeply involved in all sorts of things. Even later, like some wild stories about Amir Taki, he went to go and fight ISIS in Syria. And he was on the front line fighting ISIS, after the ISIS invasion. And he came back to UK and he was arrested on the border and he had to explain what he was doing in Syria. So this is the kind of person, that we're talking about here. Doesn't come from money, not wealthy from my understanding. He never got rich from Bitcoin because he kept spending his Bitcoin. And round about that time, there was nobody that was interested in our industry. I was one of the only that was investing in companies, and a guy called Roger Ver. No venture capitalists, no Peter Thiels. This wasn't sophisticated at this stage. This was like a bottom-up, crazy movement. And if a billionaire knocks on your door and says, hey, I want to invest in your project, it's like one of the only sources of funding you could imagine. But we already know in 2008 that Jeffrey Epstein was a convicted sex offender. And on some of Amir Taki's early posts on Bitcoin, all the conversation happened on Bitcoin Talk Forum at the time.
Right. Okay.
And he had some posts where he was renting out 16-year-old girls and selling them for anyone that wanted to buy them on this post. So that tells you about his character. He's actually came out. If you go to Amir Taki on X, You can see his response and his explanation. He's kind of saying, yeah, I took some money. We were involved in projects. And you can translate from that. That's everything I know about Amir Taki. And that's the earliest interaction that seems credible from the file drop.
Okay, and so what was his what was his connection to Bitcoin again? What did he do in relation to Bitcoin?
So Bitcoin's an open source code, so anyone can go to the GitHub repo and suggest code that they want to implement, and you can look at his entire history of what he implemented. But he got angry at Bitcoin because it wasn't private enough, and so he kind of forked off into we need more privacy and we need different types of coins, and so he kind of went down this dark coin Monero type of privacy coin route. So he kind of he kind of left the Bitcoin community route very early because he was just pissed off that it wasn't private enough.
So he was doing what you're saying is open source changes to Bitcoin, which everyone can verify. But what other engagement or interaction did he have other than that? Because I presume there'll be a lot of people who did the same thing through, is it Gift Hub you said?
Yeah, so if you want to suggest code, you can suggest improvement proposals, and you can write code and suggest it, and then it gets community reviewed, and then it has to go through a very comprehensive process of whether it gets adopted and whether people. So even if you suggest the most nefarious thing, you still got to get through all the community members and I'm not sure how much of it. I'm not even sure if any of his code ever got implemented. But he was more of an advocate. He was at one stage kind of like the CEO, as in the face of Bitcoin. The BBC loved him because he was he gave Bitcoin kind of a bad name in terms of associating it with drugs and stuff and things like Silk Road. And so the media loved going there, and there was they would go into his what looked like a crack den and squat and stuff like that, and kind of associate it with Bitcoin.
Well, that answers my question, because what I was gonna ask was if he was just a random developer who was able to, as everybody else, suggest things, then why would Jeffrey Epstein want to contact him? Why would he uniquely want to contact him? But I guess your answer to that is that he ended up becoming like the face of it. He ended up getting notoriety through the media, and so hence why it logically makes sense that Jeffrey Epstein wanted to contact him. Is that right?
Yeah, if you were around in early 2011, then you would know Amir Taki, Gavin Andreessen, Hal Finney, who was behind the scenes but on the talk forums, and then enter someone like Roger Ver, who kind of, the face was Amir Taki, which gave a very bad face. Then Gavin Andreessen kind of started taking up more of the public persona. And then it turned into Roger Ver, who was the first articulate, kind of libertarian, but businessman, entrepreneur type person. And he kind of took the reins. I gave my very first BBC interviews I recorded all my conferences, but I did some BBC interviews around about 2012. Right. But prior to that, that's what you would have known. And so if you were Jeffrey Epstein and you wanted to figure out what was going on in Bitcoin, you would have contacted Amir Taki.
Okay, that makes sense. Now, in terms of going, and I do want to talk about the privacy element of it, because Bitcoin isn't private. And so you have seen a lot of development. As you mentioned, Amir Taki wanted to do it. But in addition to that, we saw the recent development of Zcash, which essentially was branded as a privacy coin that was built or developed in Tel Aviv. Actually, let me ask you now. So what was Jeffrey Epstein's connection to that?
Yeah, so if you look at the history, there's a bunch. So Bitcoin is pseudonymous, which means every transaction is public on a blockchain. It's not like you have a bank account so you can see the history of all your transactions. You can create a unique wallet for every transaction. And you can do things like CoinJoin to obfuscate transactions. And so people were really interested in things like CoinJoin and these different types of innovation to make transactions more private, even though it's pseudonymous. And so you don't know who anyone is, but every transaction is public on a blockchain, and you can't change that. And so then the focus from more of the hardcore activists that were involved in, things like purchasing drugs on Silk Road and more activities that were, part of more of like a libertarian type of movement. You had Ross Albright, that we found out was someone called the Dread Pirate Robert, and he later was known and arrested for creating Silk Road. And Silk Road was where people started this marketplace where you could buy anything online. Now, what was quite interesting at the time is one of the very early TV appearances was when the FBI was talking about Silk Road and connecting it to buying drugs, and they would always portray it as an anonymous currency. And so it kind of became like people would use Silk Road thinking it's an anonymous currency. And that obviously created a real honeypot around this Silk Road website of people that were trying to purchase drugs online, but creating these immutable records and connecting it to the only exchange where you could buy Bitcoin, which was Mt. Gox at the time. But that's kind of a bit of the history that leads to that. But then you had people that wanted to create alternatives to Bitcoin that were more private. The first one was Darkcoin, that later became known as Dash. Then there was a movement to try and create another alternative, which today is Monero. And then later there was a company which was, who had people like Roger Ver invest in it. It had Barry Silbert invest in it, and Barry Silbert, his brother Alan Silbert, when I started advocating for Palestine, you can see on X, we always used to debate each other, because he obviously has a deep affiliation for Israel. And you can also see that an exchange, so his brother Alan Silbert created an exchange called INX. And INX had like these very questionable Israeli type of people. So I haven't seen publicly Barry Silbert ever talk about Israel, but his brother seems to advocate for Israel, and I've argued with him on X many times, and he ended up blocking me eventually because I was, dismantling some of his Hezbollah. So you could assume that Barry Silbert has guilty due to association from his brother, whether that's true or not. But you could say that there's a connection there. And so Barry Silbert funded Zcash, and then it relied upon an innovation called zero knowledge proof. Yeah. What this meant is that you could send a transaction and it could be fully anonymous. And the kind of the development around this technology is deeply associated with Tel Aviv University. A lot of cryptography and various other things and military grade encryption and various other stuff. It all tends to come from NSA, CIA, Department of Defense, Tel Aviv as well, the Israeli connection. So Zcash essentially, it relied upon a trusted setup, and what it required is some trusted people to say, initially, we're going to destroy this key. And if I'm getting the tech wrong, it doesn't matter. But the point is that there was a trusted setup. And one of the developers who I'm very skeptical of, he came around about 2014, is a guy called Peter Todd. If you look at his profile on X, he talks about advocating for a nuclear attack on Iran and various other things. So he and there were documentaries over time where they tried to claim he was Satoshi as well, but he came to the project a lot later. So Peter Todd was one of the people that you had to trust to destroy a part of the key in order to trust Zcash. And then people could send these zero knowledge transactions, but there was a tax on every transaction that went to a private corporation, a private company. And so, this was a very questionable project. It was connected to a company, and it was meant to be anonymous transactions. And then there was a trust element at the beginning, and then it's connected to all these kind of different technologies that came from Tel Aviv University. Jeffrey Epstein, anyway, it was confirmed from some of the emails, if we're to believe the emails, that he was one of the investors in that project. He showed this clear interest. Now, he may have been investing in everything he could, because that's kind of his strategy. You get access through investment, and then you try and compromise as you go further and further up the cycle. But he seemed to be heavily involved in Zcash as a project.
Yeah. Okay, so one question I've got for you, and then I'm going to come back because I've got a few more questions about the Epstein files and the links to Bitcoin. They are numerous. One of the questions, because you mentioned about the centralized nature and you're basically relying on Todd to basically destroy the key, which, based on his background,
Zcash, not Bitcoin.
About Zcash, yeah, which is possible that he may not do it because he's not a honest broker, especially when you look at his view about what's happened in Gaza. But one of the arguments against Bitcoin is that although it's claimed to be decentralized, in fact it is actually centralized, and they talk about how a lot of the block production is basically geared into 4 specific mining pools. You've got Foundry USA, which has 30%, Antpool 18%, via BTC, which has 11%, FT Pool, which has 10%, which means that the top pools currently control 65% of all total hash power, and the top 5 over 75%. Does that not go against this idea of the decentralized nature of Bitcoin, and actually in the end it's become centralized?
Yeah, so you have to look at the entire architecture of Bitcoin, because what Bitcoin is it's lots of parts, and you just described one part, which is the mining pools. And together, when you plug all these different parts together, you have the most decentralized, thing or supercomputer that exists, as it were, for transacting value. But within it, you always have attack vectors of centralization. But in itself, just by controlling a large percentage of the mining pool, you can centralize to the degree that you just said, which I agree with those stats. There's mainly 4 large mining pools. And what these mining pools are, essentially, if you're a miner, you have to invest significant amount of money in hardware, infrastructure, electricity, and data centers, cooling, all sorts of stuff. It's a significant investment and operation. It was originally a laptop, then it was GPUs, and now it's dedicated, sophisticated data centers with ASICs. And when you're trying to mine, every new Bitcoins are created every 10 minutes. And if you're mining, you essentially receive a block reward for mining, but only one miner receives that block reward because it's rewarded every 10 minutes. And so what a mining pool is essentially everybody takes all of their computer power and they connect it to a mining pool so that everybody pulls together their mining power. And then every time they find a block and gets a reward, it's split across everybody that's contributing to that mining pool. So what this does is it normalizes out your revenue. So you can guarantee every 10 minutes you'll probably get a piece of Bitcoin, rather than waiting 5 years and only getting 10 blocks or something. And so the mining pool was a way for splitting and guaranteeing that every 10 minutes or so you start to get Bitcoin. So what happens with the mining pools, if you take those, one of the largest ones is connected to a US company, and that's Digital Currency Group, which is a subsidiary called Foundry. That's connected to Barry Silbert. And then the other 3 are Chinese miners that were really very early on in the Bitcoin mining, which was predominantly done in China before there was kind of this massive movement of mining over to America. When China started to make Bitcoin mining illegal, even though they still mine today, there was a time when they had 60% of all the mining. Now it's got like 20%, and about 40% of it is in America. And so those mining pools We have had moments when one of the mining pools that doesn't even really exist today, called ghash.io, started to get close to 50% of all the all of the mining hash power. The second it got there, you have a public campaign to explain the risk, and everybody starts reallocating their hash power to another miner. And what has been invented like quite recently is more mining pools where you can still have this centralized distribution, but everyone can have their own environment called Oasis Pool. All this to say, I know it's very geeky, that while there are 4 major mining pools, it's trivial to move your power from one to the other. And there's new mining pools, which creates way more distributed, environments within a mining pool. And so that is a source of centralization with innovation that makes it more decentralized, and a trivial way that if this becomes a centralization risk, you can just move your mining over to another mining pool.
Understood. Now, going back to the Epstein files, one of the releases, and there's quite a few elements of it, one of the releases suggests that Israel, through Epstein, was paying 60% of Bitcoin core developers. And so they had them on the salary and essentially had control over the larger part of Bitcoin. And this was through a release that happened yesterday. What's your thoughts or views on that?
Okay, so the history of Bitcoin funding. So originally, the Bitcoin developers used to just put up a QR code, and anyone could send some Bitcoin, and it was more like a buy me a coffee in an anonymous, a pseudonymous environment. And that wasn't good enough. So because it wasn't giving developers enough stable revenue, I invested in a company called BitPay that later Peter Thiel invested in via Founders Fund, like a couple of years later. But I did a lot of the early rounds before all the VCs came in. The BitPay basically said, I'll fund the development. And so this company did it. At that time, it was kind of like creating the PayPal or Bitcoin, allowing businesses to accept Bitcoin easily and convert it to dollars. And then the Bitcoin community thought, no, this is too risky. This is one company funding developers. And so the solution that came out was a bunch of companies, and more companies came along, got together and created the Bitcoin Foundation, which was a not-for-profit foundation that had a bunch of board members. And those board members were people like, the CEO of Mt. Gox, Mark Cabellis, the CEO of BitInstant, Charlie Shrem, John Matonis, Bruce Fenton, who often comes up on spaces that we participate in, and Roger Ver as well. Basically, the big characters that wanted to publicly represent Bitcoin at the time.
So Bruce was one of the early guys.
Bruce Fenton, yeah, I mean, he's OG. Yeah, Bruce Fenton's been around for a very long time. Yeah, and he's still coming up at the spaces, like still helping people out.
Yeah. So sorry, you were saying. Apologies.
Yeah, no worries. And so yeah, these people made up the Bitcoin Foundation. Now, this is when I think there was deliberate operations to try and infiltrate the Bitcoin Foundation. And so people would contribute to the Bitcoin Foundation, and everyone would complain and shout at it. It's like you have this foundation that's more decentralized than just BitPay paying, but everyone could contribute, and every Bitcoiner would give some money, like on a donation basis, and it would fund the developers. But as you have humans involved, you've got a centralized attack pool now. And so I think it was attacked through a guy called Brock Pierce, who joined the board.
Right.
And Brock Pierce, in the Epstein files, it was confirmed that he had meetings with Jeffrey Epstein. Now, he came at it from a couple of ways. Firstly, he created a venture capital fund that would start one of the very first formal venture capital funds. Myself and Max Kaiser created one called Bitcoin Capital, and he created one called Blockchain Capital. He would essentially be investing in any of the Bitcoin companies that he could find at the time. And Blockchain Capital is still around today. It's had multiple rounds. They've booted Brock Pierce off. They've tried to disassociate with Brock Pierce. But if you look at Brock Pierce's background, he had but firstly, his early career was he was a child actor in Hollywood. And we know how Hollywood as an industry is in general in terms of operations, just like Jeffrey Epstein's. And he was also somebody that blew up a company during the dot-com boom and bust. He was meant to go public. And during that time, there were allegations from minors, a minor that he settled with that made accusations around, sexual crimes. I don't want to mess up YouTube right now. You get the idea. And so he had that background. Now, his crimes went away. I think there was something, I could be getting things wrong of this, but this is just from memory. So he had a very questionable background, but he kind of, through financing, tried to overwhelm people because it was impossible to get financing at that time. There was, the first venture capitalist that came along. And so he, at this time, got on the board of Bitcoin Foundation because he had money and he was the only one that really had money at that time. And he was involved in several things. He's a very important character, I think, here in understanding what happened. The story is that then later, the Bitcoin Foundation went through financial stress because there was loads of controversy. So one by one, all the board members got involved in controversy. Bruce Fenton, I haven't seen controversy around that time, but Charlie Schwem got taken down, arrested for supporting transactions to Silk Road. We also had Mt. Gox, an exchange that went bust very famously. It had 70% of all the Bitcoin. It was systemically an important exchange. And the interesting story about that is it was run by a guy called Mark Capellas, and everyone thinks he's the founder of Mt. Gox. He was on the board of the Bitcoin Foundation. He actually bought the exchange from a guy called Jeb McCaleb. And Jeb McCaleb he created the exchange. It was the reason it's called Mt. Gox. It was Magic the Gathering online exchange because it was for trading Magic the Gathering trading cards. And he repurposed it into a Bitcoin exchange because there was no price for Bitcoin at the time. People were just sending it. There was no way of, buying it. You had to mine it and send it to each other, and there was no price. And so he repurposed it into this exchange, and then he sold it to Mark Capellas. Now, this guy is interesting because he created the two cryptocurrencies. One was called XRP Ripple, and the other was called XLM Stellar. And this essentially became, the banksters operation with Ripple trying to disrupt Swift and stuff. But there was 80,000 Bitcoin missing. So he bought it without disclosing to Mark Capellas that the Bitcoin were missing. And so he ended up with this exchange that was missing 80,000 Bitcoin. And a bot was developed that pushed the price of Bitcoin from, like, when I got involved, it was $3 in 2011. But it pushed it up to like $1,000 or something. And so he ended up with this ginormous hole where he owed all this Bitcoin. The Bitcoin was missing. And it was just this, and there were hacks and various other things. Now, Mark Capellas, once the exchange got hacked and it got shut down because it was bankrupt, he actually blamed, rather than saying what happened at the exchange, he blamed it on Bitcoin itself and said it was malicious code. So he tried to discredit Bitcoin by blaming the exchange on Bitcoin itself. That was one of the. And now, what's really interesting is at the same time, if you look at the emails, one of the emails we got was between Peter Thiel and Jeffrey Epstein in 2014. Where they were talking about whether they're ready to start the campaign to tarnish Bitcoin. And so everything went wrong in 2014, and Peter Thiel and Jeffrey Epstein were communicating on, is this part of the campaign to discredit Bitcoin? Sorry, I'm paraphrasing, but something along those lines. You can find the exact wording. And this is in 2014 when Brock Pierce came along. You had the bankruptcy of the Bitcoin Foundation. You had the taking out of various board members. You had Mt. Gox get hacked and go bust. You had them blaming Bitcoin the code. Everything that could have gone wrong went wrong in 2014. It was like the most disastrous year for Bitcoin. And that was the year that Peter Thiel and Jeffrey Epstein were trying to, essentially, they were communicating on, yeah, people don't know whether it's a currency or a unit of account or a medium of exchange. So at the same time, Brock Pierce, via however he was funded, and I think his covert mechanisms, managed to get funding into $3 million into Coinbase.
Right.
He also managed to get funding into, not Brock Pierce. Brock Pierce was introduced to Blockstream, and Blockstream was a company that when the Bitcoin Foundation went bust, they kind of they took a bunch of the developers and put it into a corporate structure. And that one of those people was not a Bitcoin developer, but a Bitcoin architect guy that was advising on systems called Adam Back. So to put this all together, you had funding into Blockstream that took a bunch of the developers into a centralized company. You then had money going into Coinbase that was one of the important companies that later got venture capital funding and, you know, all these different large companies. Then Brock Pierce also funded a developer to create a new project called Realcoin. And Realcoin was a really strange project to us at the time because it basically was a blockchain dollar that existed as a token on top of Bitcoin. And it was later rebranded to be called Tether. And so then he sold that project, Tether, to a company called Bitfinex. And so this was the introduction of Tether, which was essentially the project that now, if you go right forward to today, is involved in Clarity Act, Genius Act, creating a digital dollar, integration into Peter Thiel's Palantir, Elon Musk's social credit score. So it tells you in 2014, there seemed to be a very deliberate operation to use Bitcoin as a gateway drug onto a digital dollar. And so this is, what I think one of the plans was. And the communication between Peter Thiel and Jeffrey Epstein was saying, yeah, the Bitcoin people are a bit crazy. They don't know whether it's a currency, medium of exchange, unit of account, store of value. They're very confused. And Peter Thiel said, is this part of the, operation, whatever it may be? So that's how I interpret this. So all of the apparatus was set up in that 2014 to try and infiltrate Bitcoin as many ways as possible.
Just one question on that, Simon. You mentioned Bitcoin Foundation, and you've kind of detailed various aspects of it. One of the people in the Epstein files, I believe, is someone called by the name of Jamie Dimon. Jamie Dimon apparently is also was involved in Bitcoin Foundation, and that was another means by which allegedly Epstein.
Jamie Dimon's the CEO of JP Morgan.
Okay, and so is he? Sorry,
I think that would be a fake one. Is that authenticated?
So what the claim is that Epstein was funding the Bitcoin Foundation and coordinating with Jamie Dimon and many of the large banks to position BTC is basically it.
Yeah, that sounds like narrative on top of the story. What we do know from Epstein, and remember, there's a bunch of red herrings and people putting out fake screenshots and stuff.
They are for sure.
Yeah. But Jamie Dimon is the CEO of JP Morgan. We do know that Epstein was, I believe, using allegedly Brock Pierce in order to funnel money and blockchain capital into infrastructure. There's no evidence that was connected to banks or Jamie Dimon at that stage. And if I see any, then I'll look at it, but I haven't seen any. I can tell you what came next, though.
Yeah, please do. Yeah.
So at this point, we had the discrediting of all of the board members one by one in the Bitcoin Foundation. And it was left with a guy who kind of, the two people that were left Everyone stepped down or left or, resigned or whatever. But it was left with Brock Pierce and John Matonis. John Matonis kind of was the last man standing, like the chairman, and Brock Pierce still hung around. Then we had the handover from Bitcoin Foundation to MIT, the college and the innovation lab within MIT. So around 2015, I think it was, maybe the timeline's a bit off. MIT essentially started creating, Jeffrey Epstein funded into MIT. And then MIT created a new offshoot called DCI, Digital Currency Initiative. And the Digital Currency Initiative took 3 of the core developers and gave some funding to those 3 core developers. Blockstream had offshoot at this time, and it started raising finance. One of their investors was Jeffrey Epstein via Digital Garage, and the CEO was a guy called Adam Back. And Adam Back, in the files that we've seen right now, he confirmed on X that he did take that money. It was $500,000 into Blockstream. And there was also confirmation that a guy called Andy Back was on one of the Epstein Islands.
Right.
And then there was another confirmation email that the co-founders of Blockstream, and one of them, Adam Back, they had the name Adam Back, and his co-founders were with flight, confirmations that it was arranged that they'll be going to the island. Adam Back, at this stage, has not confirmed whether he went to the island. But the emails imply that was arranged, and he did go.
So,
yeah.
Sorry, just continue.
Yeah. So there you got Blockstream, and then you've got a Bitcoin Foundation, which kind of is moved over to this digital currency initiative, and this digital currency initiative funded 3 of the core developers, and then a bunch of developers were in Blockstream. So you could look at those different offshoots, and then you had this covert structure with Brock Pierce. And what did Brock Pierce do? He had Blockchain Capital, a VC. He had Tether, that then was passed on to Bitfinex. And then we had the PSYOP of all PSYOPs, which was John Matonis, who was the chairman of the Bitcoin Foundation that was just a skeleton at this stage.
Right.
He used the credibility of Bitcoin Foundation, the remnants of it, now that everyone had been taken out, to introduce who he said was Satoshi Nakamoto and revealed it to the world. And he introduced Dr. Craig Wright. And Dr. Craig Wright claimed to be Satoshi Nakamoto. And then Gavin Andreessen, one of the developers, he came out. He wasn't part of he wasn't part of Blockstream, but Gavin Andreessen, I believe he was one of the developers that was funded via the Digital Currency Initiative. I may have got that one wrong. People can fact check that. I'm just doing this off memory, so I think he was one of the 3 developers, but. Right. They'll let me know if that's wrong. But anyway, he then lied on BBC and national TV and at this conference, saying that he had cryptographic, indisputable evidence that Dr. Craig Wright controlled the Satoshi wallets, and he cryptographically proved it. Now, what that means is that essentially the Satoshi wallets, there was 1 million Bitcoin mined. Only those that have the keys can prove, if you have the keys, you can prove indisputable that you can control those keys just by sending a message on the chain. And Gavin Andreessen lied and said that that happened. Dr. Craig Wright recently went to prison for lying in court and manufacturing PDFs to prove that he was Satoshi Nakamoto. Now, this implies to me, I always thought, is this guy just a psychopath? To me, it sounds like he had no choice. Like, he sent himself to prison. like went and, went to that right till the end on that lie as if he had no choice but to do it. So anyway, so you had Gavin Andreessen, John Matonis, and then he took some of the influential characters at the time that then publicly said, yes, I think this is Satoshi. Now, at this time, I was at a conference. I can't remember where it was. I think it was in Mexico or somewhere. And I was speaking. I would speak every year at the annual conferences. The early ones in 2013 were organized by the Bitcoin Foundation. One of them was in Netherlands, and then I think the next one was in Mexico, if I remember correctly. There was one in UK. But at that conference, Brock Pierce, who looks like he was under the influence, made it out like it was really urgent that I speak to him. And so I spoke to him, and he spent probably 2.5 hours, like definitely under the influence, trying to persuade me that Dr. Craig Wright was Satoshi Nakamoto and that I should publicly, put my support behind him. So I know, not through any of these emails, but from my personal experience, he seemed very invested in getting everyone to believe that behind the scenes, that Dr. Craig Wright was Satoshi Nakamoto. And at that point, Roger Ver came out and said that he thought it, and he was a big voice. Now, what did that do? This is when, at the same time, one of the ASIC manufacturers in China was a company called Bitmain. And Bitmain got funding from Sequoia Capital, a large venture capitalist at the time. And they created a version of Bitcoin that was called Bitcoin ABC. And they publicly said, if you don't change Bitcoin to have bigger blocks, then we're going to fork off and create a new version of Bitcoin that was later called Bitcoin Cash. And so there was an attempt to create a digital dollar, discredit and infiltrate Bitcoin, and create an alternative, multiple alternatives to Bitcoin. And so all of this was a divide and conquer strategy to fracture the community more and more and more and take people off in different directions. And then we entered into this massive civil war in Bitcoin that looked like a military operation where we were all on the same team, and then everyone fractured off into different parts. And then you had the big blockers and the small blockers, and the people that believed via Blockstream that we should invest in layer 2, which is an innovation to scale Bitcoin in a different way. And then Blockstream started creating all that technology, and later created a federated network for banks to launch tokens on top of Bitcoin that could essentially be central bank digital currencies and all sorts of stuff. So you can see that this all fractured all over the place round about 2014, 2015, 2016, 2017 phase. And you can connect it all to those different, trying to get in all those different networks.
That makes sense. Now, going back to the Epstein files, I've got a couple of more questions for you, Simon. The first one is, obviously, in the Epstein files, Jeffrey Epstein claims that he knew the founder of Bitcoin. So the question to you is, and I'll read it out, did Epstein know Satoshi Nakamoto? He says, quote, I've spoken to some of the founders of Bitcoin who are very excited. So was he talking about Satoshi, or who was he talking about?
I checked that one, and I don't think it's actually in the actual files. So I don't think it's, I don't think that's an authenticated email. But I don't know. What was the date of it? Was it 2009?
So the claim is, and I'm not double checked the file. It says the file is EFTA 008-15445. In terms of the specific email, is 2016. He sent an email to Rafat, is it Alsbag, and Aziza Al Ahmadi, which is the same. I believe she's the UAE based Saudi woman. Oh, sorry.
Okay. I've seen a bunch of really weird emails that look like spoof. Like, for example, one of the characters is a guy that's always on TV. He's like a bit of is a guy called Anthony Pompliano. And there was an email where, like, he was claiming he emailed Jeffrey Epstein, or someone that said he was him, emailed Jeffrey Epstein and said, "I'm a member of the IRGC, and you should give me $10,000. I've got a blackmail operation," and then he forwarded it to the FBI. So, I mean, 2016 saying he knows who Satoshi is, maybe he does. That's a new one. I haven't seen that one, so I haven't. But if it's authentic, then yeah, you got to also look at the actual whether the emails are there. Would Jeffrey Epstein know who Satoshi Nakamoto is? I don't think there's any evidence to suggest that. And so if there's something that comes out, I have my own opinion who Satoshi Nakamoto is. I think it was a guy called Len Sassaman.
Right.
And so we'll see.
Why do you think it was Len Sassaman?
So my understanding of the origin story is it came from David Chom, who created DigiCash, and DigiCash was shut down and taken out because it was centralized. And so round about this time, we got the white, after that, we had the white paper launched. And one of the early developers was, Len Sassaman. All of the different evidence around timing, social media posts, his connection to Europe, because it wasn't really in American time zones and various other things. Pretty much, I think there's the most compelling evidence that Len Sassaman, and he also was, well, the official story is that he committed suicide, and that coincides exactly with the time frame that Satoshi Nakamoto left the project. And Gavin Andreessen said, one of the early developers, that he was going to meet the CIA. Then Satoshi Nakamoto said, "I don't want to be anything to do with this." That was a time when WikiLeaks was also starting to use Bitcoin after the financial blockade. And then Len Sassaman he said he committed suicide. I think I question whether it was a suicide. I don't want to be disrespectful to the family, but he was taken out, and then later Hal Finney also died of natural causes. Apparently, is the allegations. I think these two had the private keys.
So you who was the two? So Len Sassaman, and who was the second person?
Sassaman and Hal Finney.
Hal Finney. So I mean, just to kind of say, you believe that Len Sassaman was Satoshi Nakamoto, possibly based on what you're theorizing. The CIA kind of wanted access to him and or his wallets, and then they took him out. Possibly.
That's a possibility. Yeah, you got to draw a few connections, but I think the case of why he's Satoshi Nakamoto, there's lots of videos out there that people have done the full analysis of every post and the timing of social media and the linguistic analysis and various other things, the timing of his suicide relative to Satoshi leaving the project.
Understood. But why would the CIA want to take him out if, according to your view, it was the CIA who developed Bitcoin?
Well, it was open sourced, and DigiCash wasn't open sourced. And it was, whether it was created as it was meant to be a honeypot with a closed source backdoor, but Len Sassaman open sourced it, and the design was open source.
Right.
And I'm not sure it was meant to be the way it was actually designed, where you couldn't have a backdoor. And so later, I think the project became a gateway drug for a CBDC, which was how they pivoted their operation. But if it wasn't open sourced and the design wasn't done with nodes and a distributed supercomputer, then this could have been just like DigiCash, an operation and a honeypot with a backdoor.
So you're basically saying that, in your view, the CIA creates it. They don't plan to make it open source. What happens is he gets involved and he essentially makes it open source, which wasn't the original intention of the CIA. And then what happens is Sassaman becomes the reason why it's open source. And then we've got the current version of the Bitcoin we have. The CIA then want to get basically into a conversation with Sassaman, or maybe get him under control or whatever it is. He refuses, and somehow he allegedly has a suicide. is basically what you're saying, right?
Yeah, and all of those developers, you can see that they had connections to being called in by intelligence, and there's evidence around all of it, and Gavin Andreessen as well. And then you had basically the Satoshi Nakamoto saying, "I'm leaving the project," when Gavin Andreessen confirmed to Satoshi that he's going to meet the CIA and present what Bitcoin is. And so all of this is, again, you have to connect a few dots. I can't prove that. That's just my experience of what I think happened. I couldn't prove it to you. But it's the story that makes the most amount of sense to me.
Well, that was actually my second question, was whether Epstein was Satoshi, but you've kind of answered that already. Now, in terms of from a crypto perspective, Bitcoin perspective, what's the kind of biggest takeaway you've got from the release of the Epstein files?
That there were multiple attempts to try and infiltrate. And to me, it just confirms that, Bitcoin, firstly, that Bitcoin resisted all these attempts. There were compromise all along the way. But at every level, we still ended up with a structural design that no single person can control. And so for me, Brock Pierce, I think we got the confirmation that he was the character that I suspected he was. And how many different attempts there were. I also think that everyone's taking their narrative. As the community factioned off into parts, some said, "I believe in Adam back." And so you've got the community that are kind of defending that line. Then you've got people that believe blocks should have been big and they ended up with Bitcoin Cash and Bitcoin SV. Everyone's using it as evidence for their narrative, rather than taking the full picture that you can see every part was infiltrated. So the people over here are saying, look, Adam back, he was on the island, it's pedo coin, right?
Right.
People over here, I think there's a clear story that the fake Toshi was an op. And in the end, what did we get? Well, we got what we're having today, which is Peter Thiel, AI Palantir, David Sachs, stable coins, and then Elon Musk with social credit scores.
Yeah.
And the mechanism that is being pitched to solve the American debt crisis is programmable money and a stable coin. And so there's a Q-tard op right now to make people believe that Trump is taking on the Federal Reserve and the system. And the end result is you're going to have programmable Orwellian 1984 version of the dollar. And Genius Act ensures that the banks end up with all the power in it anyway. And so you can see these psyops where they've manufactured consent with the Q-tards and the MAGA-tards to believe that Trump's taken down the Fed. The legislation is just moving us to this, this massive police and surveillance state. And Bitcoin was the gateway drug. And now you can discredit Bitcoin by pointing there. You can discredit Bitcoin by pointing over here. But really, you're pushing everyone over to this stable coin. And then you're trying to, and then there was one major operation, which you have to connect a few dots. But what came next after MIT, there was a digital currency initiative. And that was headed up by a guy called Gary Gensler. And Gary Gensler ended up being the head and chair of the SEC. Gary Gensler is in the Epstein files in terms of connections, nothing damning, but conversations. They were introduced, they were connected. The new head of the Federal Reserve, Kevin Wallace, he's also similar types of connections, nothing damning, but similar things. You can see these people know each other or were connected to each other. And then what did Gary Gensler do? Well, he ended up becoming the chair of the SEC. Now, nobody in our industry, it seems like Jeffrey Epstein was able to get a meeting, but there was only one person that was able to get a meeting, despite the fact that Coinbase was the largest company. all these different companies, but no one could get a meeting with the SEC. There was only one person, Sam Bankman-Fried. So Sam Bankman's SBF was the only person that got a meeting, and he was, through his connections, which is on the board, was the law firm Sullivan and Cromwell, which is essentially the law firm involved in Mossad, CIA, all sorts of stuff. And FTX was drafting the legislation for what later became known as Clarity Act today, under Biden and now under Trump. And so you can see this different thing. So what happened under Gary Gensler? Well, there was also other operations. One of the ops that I was involved in is Celsius. And Celsius, I had money on Celsius. I invested because I invested in many of the different companies. And this was the last company I invested in when I said I'm out and I'm divesting from everything. And I'm just keeping Bitcoin in self-custody. This was my last one. Now, when you look at Celsius, it was a multi-billion-dollar Ponzi scheme. And FTX was another one of those as well. FTX's board and connections, these are higher up connections to, the college circuit, elites in law firms, really an elite circle that had SBF as the front person. But also Alex Mashinsky was the front person for Celsius. Behind the scenes, you had offices in Israel. You had a custody acquisition called GK8, which was an Israeli custody company. You had his co-founder, Daniel Leone, is now has got an AI startup with their customer being the Prime Minister's Office of Israel. You had his wife, who became head of social media for the IDF and pushed out propaganda to end UNRWA. And take out, UNRWA by connecting it that the UN was part of October the 7th. She was the head of lending at Celsius. And you had all of these different connections. And one of the things that led to some of the loss, that led to Alex Mashinsky trying to make up the loss and trading and all sorts of stuff, was a hack from a company called Bancor DAO. And Bancor DAO, the shareholders, the major shareholders, were the niece and nephew of Benjamin Netanyahu. So you had a hack that led to a catastrophic loss. You had reckless processes. And you had a team of IDF-connected propagandists and AI cybersecurity and, Israeli-connected shills. Now, Alex Mashinsky was the only one that went to prison. He went down for 12 years. He took 650,000 victims with him, wiped out the savings of billions of dollars. And the SEC, in the court case, was communicating with Alex Mashinsky and Celsius for 2 years during the court documents. And I know that because I read every court document, 4,000 different court documents over 2 years I read. Most people would never read all this stuff, so they wouldn't know. But the SEC knew about this, and there were ongoing investigations, but it was still allowed to go from a small Ponzi scheme to a $25 billion Ponzi scheme. And so to me, there was a compromised network at the SEC level. And the idea was to discredit the industry, crash the price of Bitcoin down to $15,000 from a high of $70,000. And then one by one, allow BlackRock to approve the Bitcoin ETF. Suddenly you had Michael Saylor appear, who revived this old zombie, 2008 company, and to get as much Bitcoin as possible, lever it up with as much debt as possible, and centralize as much Bitcoin as possible. And then Cantor Fitzgerald and Howard Lutnick suddenly come along and start going out to all the people like Adam Back saying, why don't you take all of your Bitcoin and put it in a company and then we can issue you some loans against it? and did the same with Jack Mallers and Strike, and started creating all of these Bitcoin treasury companies by trying to co-opt Bitcoiners and get them to just lever up with debt, and just all the business was the most stupid concept that Michael Saylor came up with, which was have a public company, issue debt, sell equity, and buy Bitcoin. So it's just this stupid vehicle of taking Bitcoin that people had in self-custody and making them put it in custody. It all ended up in Coinbase that Jeffrey Epstein invested in the seed round. You connect all of these dots together, and if someone that lived through it, and then you start looking at other operations. Now, me and you, Suleiman, we met for the first time on Mario's space.
Yeah.
That space was when SBF came up, and Peter Thiel came up and told everyone to take their money out of the crypto-friendly bank, Silicon Valley Bank. Bill Ackman came up and was like trying to tell everyone that we'll buy the bank for a dollar if the Fed agrees and FDIC agrees to bail out the banks. And the bank executives at Signature and Silvergate said they're fine. They didn't need the money, but they all got wiped out. And so the three crypto-friendly banks, and then Peter Thiel comes along and says, I'm creating a Bitcoin bank. And suddenly Trump introduces the legislation that allows banks to put Bitcoin on their balance sheet. And then you get Clarity Act that allows JP Morgan to get favorable terms in issuing Federal Reserves and creating stable coins. And then you have a covert CBDC via, this act. And then Trump says, we're going to have a Bitcoin strategic reserve. But the language that he uses in the Bitcoin strategic reserve was that we can confiscate Bitcoin and put it as a strategic reserve. And who did he pardon? He pardoned CZ from Binance, Russ Albright, and co-opted Tether. And remember, Bitfinex got hacked for 120,000 Bitcoin. They're now on the American Bitcoin Strategic Reserve. Russ Albright, his Bitcoin are on the Bitcoin Strategic Reserve. But somehow, after he was pardoned, there was like a $13 million transaction where a bunch of Bitcoin showed up on his wallets. All of these different transactions are happening with the Gulf states. CZ only went to prison for 4 months, but he agreed to hand over the compliance department to the American government and the Department of Justice, who got access to all of the data and then started freezing people's funds in Palestine, in Turkey, in Lebanon, on request of Israel. And so clearly to me, there was a covert operation to centralize as much Bitcoin as possible, get people onto Tether, confuse people with shitcoins that were all funded by Silicon Valley. All of these different meme coin, like casinos, all funded by Peter Thiel's funding. All of this gambling that's happening, with Polymarket, suddenly Peter Thiel and his funds start getting in. And you can see that there is, at the highest level, an operation to just create this crypto casino, degenerate gambling, everyone on a surveillance state, stable coin, seize people's Bitcoin to build a Bitcoin strategic reserve rather than buying them. And the Trump administration is calling it, we're going to make America great again by making it crypto capital of the world. In the meantime, all of the crypto companies, none of them are in America. They're all in Dubai. They're all in British Virgin Islands. They're all in Cayman Islands. They're all in El Salvador and stuff in the tax neutral jurisdictions. So it's a massive psyop, when you connect the dots together.
And I think that's why what you say is extremely important, which is to have Bitcoin in self-custody. You mentioned how Saylor has essentially leveraged Bitcoin and made it into something that is debt-ridden. You also have, for example, as you mentioned, Coinbase, which is a centralized exchange, which basically has control over your Bitcoin and has control over your assets. And the same with a lot of these trading.
And all of the Bitcoin from the Bitcoin ETFs, they're all using Coinbase, with the exception of a few.
Ex-
So they've got billions of, we're talking this massive honeypot of Bitcoin there.
Yeah, so I'm with you. I think the only way you would have anything that would be where you would have complete control over would be either self custody Bitcoin or physical gold or silver. So I'm with you on that. But
And there's
Simon,
an advantage when you self custody, and I'll like leave that because when you self custody, you run a node, and when you run a node, you verify your own transactions. And so I know that's geeky, but the elites still want the exit, which is Bitcoin and self custody, where you run your own nodes, and anyone else can have that as well. They can't stop you from doing it, but what they do want to do is they want to control the price, make you sell your Bitcoin or borrow against your Bitcoin, get you trading and leveraging shitcoins because they want to suck up as much of the Bitcoin as possible. And the elites will be using it in self custody. And so the real movement here is I believe that we are witnessing an operation to say that Bitcoin is pedo coin created by Jeffrey Epstein and it's Israel and Mossad. Because they're taking the half truths of all these centralized attack vectors, but we still have the largest, most distributed supercomputer around countries all around the world. We still have 25,000 people running nodes that anyone can run. We still have the ability to hold Bitcoin in self custody. And what they want is for you to borrow against your Bitcoin so that essentially Howard Lutnick and his sons, and Donald Trump and his sons, and Steve Witkoff and his sons, that have created an infrastructure, can engage in market manipulation to take your Bitcoin so that they end up with it, centralizing it, and then they can use it to manipulate the short-term price of Bitcoin as well. So you don't have the freedom, but they still want the freedom.
yeah, they want the freedom and the control. Simon, first of all, obviously, really appreciate you. You're a close friend of mine. Where can people find you? You're on X. On X, it's Simon Dixon Twit, right?
Yeah.
And that's
Simon
you
Dixon
find you
Twit.
on X. And on YouTube, it's Simon Dixon 21, I believe, right?
Yeah, at Simon Dixon 21. But if you put Simon Dixon in, you'll find a 15-year-old YouTube channel where I've documented this whole journey from before Bitcoin, from the monetary reform days. And then every week I do a real geeky breakdown like this of everything that happened this week in macroeconomics, geopolitics, and Bitcoin and tech, but just focus on monetary flows rather than anything else.
Well, first of all, your channel is very informative, and I've learned quite a lot, especially from the crypto aspect and the financial aspect from you. So I definitely recommend people following your channel, Simon Dixon 21, where you do a very detailed explanation once a week on Fridays, and also your X page, which is a Simon Dixon Twit, where you tweet and really give up to date information. But is there anywhere else anyone can find you, Simon? Because you're a man of all fields.
Yeah, I'm trying to get into decentralized social media. I'm still find myself on X, but I'm on Noster. At some point, we're going to have to get over there if you use Noster. You can look me up over there. And now those are the two platforms. But if everything goes wrong, I back everything up at SimonDixon.com and created an infrastructure in case I get cancelled. And of course, I regularly join Suleiman Spaces. We both took a stand on. We were on the top stages on Spaces, like that's where we met with all these SBF operations and stuff. And we clearly saw a bias that was forming on X Spaces, and so we forked off, and took the unpopular thing of supporting Palestine at the time, which is now the popular view. And so I decided to join Suleiman Spaces, so I regularly contribute there because I don't want to support the Zio propaganda.
Yeah, and you're there daily, so people get your real life knowledge and information every day. And we are now the biggest spaces. So I really appreciate you, Simon. And thank you for coming on. I appreciate it. And we'll probably do this again when there's more news about Bitcoin, because according to you, they're trying to take you boys out. So there's going to be more attack vectors. Appreciate you as always.
Yeah, and I recommend any of Suleiman's interviews with Ryan Dawson or any of his documentaries and stuff, because that's where I really learned this Epstein stuff from, and then I kind of combined it with my own experience. But it's really important to understand this stuff. So thank you for everything you've done, Suleiman, as well. It's been a wild couple of years since being involved in this cause. And I think we're all smarter for it at the end. So just want to show some appreciation for your work as well.
Well, much love to you as well, Simon. I think you've been a juggernaut and you've basically really helped people over these last few years. And I know we're going to be working on other projects as well in the future. So appreciate you as always, Simon. Thank you so much.
All right. Bye-bye. Okay, awesome. Hope you enjoyed that interview. I do want to say, if you're just tuning in now, make sure you go to the beginning in the intro and go back to this as well, because I did make some corrections, over people that have contacted me since in order to clarify their position. But I hope you enjoyed that, and we will keep sharing this journey. For those of you that want to dig deeper, head over to SimonDixon.com, and I did do a very long blog specifically on whether the CIA created Bitcoin and who is Satoshi Nakamoto. And I also did very specific long documentaries on and blog posts referring to other people's work as well, on whether Trump is blackmailed by Epstein, and it goes through the whole history, and Epstein before Epstein and the different mafia circles as well. Also, a long documentary that Ryan Dawson did that I mentioned on 9/11. I put a version of that on my blog, where it's a blog post around from 9/11 to the White House, and combine that with my own analysis as well. And also, I did several interviews on Jeffrey Epstein and Bitcoin, which you can all find on my blog as well. Now, what I really want you to understand is that it's only when you get the nuance of the structure of Bitcoin, how you realize that, look, people can criticize it and people can say all these, point to these problems, but that in itself is just pointing to one part of the structure rather than the complete holistic structure that's been said, that's been created here. And we ain't going to get another one. Like, we have seen multiple times the psyops to try and fork off Bitcoin, create a cheaper, faster, better version. And we've still only got one network that has, and it has pockets of issues and centralization. But the whole time, this has been an open source boardroom where whenever we find compromise, we attack it, and things change. And that's the whole concept of an anti-fragile network. Nothing else is like it. Everything, there is not going to be another one like this. And so when someone criticizes one part of centralization, you just have to ask the question, what is more decentralized and more secure? And I can tell you there's nothing out there. And so people talk about the only way to exit the system is with cash. I agree. We cash. But what is cash? It is inflated fiat currency. And so it's great for short-term opt-out, but what are you going to do with your savings? Well, then you're like, well, it's gold in self-custody. And I agree. I like cash. I like gold. And I think they are all genuine opt-outs. But try and store gold at scale where you can cross a border and you can spend it. What happens is you end up with a gold IOU that someone else stores, or a digital currency version of gold, which is a token on top of a gold IOU that somebody else is storing. And so at the moment, everyone's trying to get their gold because we had this massive run up and then we had a big correction, and the world is changing and switching to a multipolar world order. Try and get your physical gold. You can't get it because if everyone gets it, the gold doesn't exist, just like with a bank. And just like eventually we will see a self-custody story with Bitcoin. I've seen it time and time again. Whether you were in Mt. Gox, whether you were in the Bitfinex hack, whether you were in FTX, whether you were receiving yield through Celsius, whether you're now trusting the Epstein financial institutions in order to think that they're more credible in order to do the exact same thing that they did before, but this time with the institutions that can privatize the gain and socialize the losses through bailouts. And that is the psyops. We are in one battle, and the only battle is, and this is how to judge people, because we've always been in this open source boardroom, is the message that they're pitching me in the community leading to centralization or decentralization? And so right now, people will ask me, well, where do you stand on Bitcoin Core versus NOTs, for example? Because what happened as soon as people started questioning core developers, another competing implementation comes along, and those that are running nodes can decide which implementation to run. That creates resistance against core. And we've already started to see, as a result of these revelations, some people are handing over their commit access on the GitHub repo, and some people are leaving. And so this is how the project works. You have these controversies and compromises, and if they weren't trying to compromise the network, we'd have a serious problem, because it's the only network that people care about in the whole crypto thing, because they created all of the Silicon Valley money printing shit coins in the crypto market and all the different psyops. But the fact that they're trying to compromise is why we need to draw attention to it. And once we draw attention to it, the anti-fragile network changes. And so in analyzing whether someone's a good actor or a bad actor, I look at Adam Back, Luke Dash Jr., for example. Now, these people could be compromised, may not be compromised. I don't know. I've got my opinions about it, and I shared some of my opinions. But what is Adam Back's actions doing today relative to what his actions were before? Before, he was a cypherpunk focused on a decentralized structure, proof of work, blockchain, various other things. What is he doing today? He's shilling for strategy. He's shilling for Tether. He's talking about building liquid federated networks for banks, and he's creating technology that may centralize. And at the same time, he could be building other types of technology which are leading to more decentralization. But I would choose to boycott and use someone else or some other type of technology because of everything that we have seen. You know, this is important. Now, is Luke Dash Jr. compromised? Well, some people claim that, he's creating a soft fork and is involved in NOTs, which is a competing implementation when you're running your nodes. Sorry about the geeky stuff. I just want to help you understand this. You don't need to understand this, but slowly you could join the community. Because if you want to become sovereign, there's still nothing else. This is the best that we got. Now, what is he doing? Well, he's creating technology in order to decentralize mining pools more. And he's also creating technology to make sure that if somebody wants to put JPEGs and photos on the Bitcoin blockchain that may be connected to child photos, that it's more difficult to do that. At the same time, could that be a psyop in order to make the network more centralized and faction it off further? I don't discount that. The whole point of this is that we're able to choose and we're able to self-custody. And that's the point. Once you self-custody, you're not having somebody else make that choice for you. And once you're running a node, you can put resistance and pressure against the core developers, which may lead to handing over positions. And we have competing implementations in case it gets compromised in one implementation. And that's the whole point. For 15 years, I've seen Bitcoin react and resist against attacks to try and centralize it as much as possible. And so that's the nuance that we need you to be smarter with, because the centralizers know this. And that's why they're creating Bitcoin-backed loans and leverage products and Bitcoin treasury companies and ETFs and custody service, because they're on the other side of your team. And when they now have built this Bitcoin derivative complex to manipulate the short-term price of Bitcoin and fool you into getting margin called or selling your Bitcoin by connecting it to Jeffrey Epstein, you are either, selling it to them, or you're going to be part of the community that is actually owning more Bitcoin this month than last month, is becoming more sovereign, and is able to self-custody and engage further and further into the ecosystem in order to preserve this mechanism to remain sovereign. It's not going to make everyone ethical. It's not communism. It's not this is going to redistribute wealth across everybody. No, you still have a choice. You get the price you want. You can now buy Bitcoin at $65,000 before you had to buy it at $125,000. I wouldn't even encourage trading or degeneracy. Have a longer term thought about this. Own more Bitcoin this month than last month, whatever the price is. And so far, not financial advice, everyone has been able to gain the sovereignty that they need. And that has allowed them to transact whatever the centralized forces want you to do. And you can take that anywhere in the world, wherever you want to go. And you've been able to own it without counterparty. And so far, the fixed supply over the 17 years of Bitcoin has outperformed most markets. And yeah, priced in gold, you've had a gold run. And so diversify into gold. The whole point here is that for spending, what are your options? For saving, what are your options? And for investing, what are your options? Are you becoming more sovereign or less sovereign? There's no perfection here. You're either doing better decisions or worse decisions. Every day you make a decision. Is this better or is this worse? Because it's never going to be perfect. And that's what everybody needs to appreciate. And so with that in mind, I hope you enjoyed that we are just here to tell the truth. As I see it, I may get things wrong. You can put comments below on anything you think I got wrong. And what I did is I created a blog on SimonDixon.com where we took all of the different emails related to Bitcoin. I put my narrative around it. You can make your own narrative based upon the screenshots and the emails. And I'm going to keep adding to that every time new files come out and new information. And our job is to consume that information and boycott those that are trying to centralize Bitcoin more and support the initiatives that lead to more decentralization in Bitcoin. And there's going to have to remain a core community that hold that to account. And that's what the block size war was. In the end, when the miners tried to centralize, when the VCs tried to centralize, when the companies tried to centralize, when Jeffrey Epstein tries to centralize, we resisted back with a user-activated soft fork. And it was those that had Bitcoin in self-custody and that were running nodes that were able to participate. Everyone else, they gave that decision to somebody else. Most people will give that decision to somebody else. But as long as there is a core community, and at the moment there's 25,000 nodes of people, and the majority is still in self-custody, then we have a resistance against the centralizing forces. And that's the best that we got, because there ain't going to be anything better. And the moment there is something better, I'll tell you about it. But if you look at the security behind all these alternatives, they're trivial to attack relative to the anti-fragile nature of Bitcoin. And so you either give that Bitcoin to somebody else or you put your energy in the real pedo coin. And what is the real pedo coin? It's fiat currency. It's the dollar. It's the euro. It's the pound. We all know that. That's what the Epstein files released. And those that wanted to try and control Bitcoin tried to infiltrate it. And where do they go? To the attack vector, the humans, the corporations, and the centralized institutions. But we've got enough of the ecosystem that is decentralized to be able to push back against those attack vectors. And you try and build another distributed supercomputer located geographically around the world with countries that hate each other in a multipolar world where there's enough security behind that, where there's not an investment where anyone could take this whole ecosystem down. And that's the nuance. And we have to be smarter. And that's why at Simon Dixon Hard Talk, I want you to have the information so that you don't fall for the media and the psyops because they're lying to you. So with that in mind, I now want to focus in on the macroeconomic impact of the Epstein files, as well as the geopolitical impact of the Epstein files. And what I'm going to do is I appeared on the Capital Cosm YouTube channel with Danny. And Danny interviewed me on everything that's happening with the price of gold, with the treasuries, with everything. And then we went into the geopolitics section. So we're going to now play the second interview of this Simon Dixon Hard Talk live. And then I'm going to come back with some concluding thoughts after the interview. So Azad, let's move over to the second interview that was recorded this week with Danny from Capital Cosm.
You're watching Capital Cosm. My name is Danny. It is February 3rd, 2026. And my guest today is Simon Dixon. He's a Bitcoin OG investor and a macro analyst, a geopolitical analyst, and a financial analyst. Simon, what is there anything you don't analyze? I mean, you are just like a modern day Renaissance man.
Look, I just follow the money. I've worked in finance. I've invested in finance. I've built businesses around finance. 25 years I've been involved in finance, and I just do one thing, and it's follow the money.
Yeah. Well, you do it really well. So I'm glad to have you on, and let's just dive right into the key stories here. We've got so much to unpack. I'm looking at the metals prices. They're currently rebounding, but who knows where they'll be, by the time this video comes out. So, it's extremely volatile right now. But I think what's pressing on everyone's mind right now, I don't know about you, but I would presume this is the case with you as well. My X feed is just littered with all of this Epstein file stuff, posts and all this other stuff. I want you to, kind of give us a high level view. What was the purpose of all of this? Why did they release these? I mean, there's obviously pressure to the administration to release the files, but why now? And they released about half of them. And they seem to implicate a good deal of elites, but also, there's also some ambiguity here and there. But yeah, what's the rationale? What do you think they released these files at this point in time?
Yeah, to answer that question, it depends on your understanding of who you think controls the Epstein files. From my understanding, I've always debated in my mind, because I've always believed government is subordinate to, finance, military, and technical are the main factions of power that exist right now, the main lobbies that control governments. And at the very top, I've always said it's the financial industrial complex. I've wrestled in my mind whether the military industrial complex via the deep state control the Epstein files or whether it's the financial industrial complex. But I've never believed it was the government that has full control over these files. Now, obviously, the FBI gets to go through them, but the actual decision to release them, I think it goes layers above government. And so one thing you'll notice is that I think this is a part of the metals conversation, the currency conversation, because this essentially dismantles and gives confirmation to all the quote unquote conspiracy theories, whether it be, terrorist groups like ISIS and Al Qaeda, whether they're controlled by Western intelligence, that's confirmed through these conversations, whether it be that Jeffrey Epstein was communicating with the higher levels of technology executives, military executives, financial executives, foreign leaders, royal families, monarchies. This is all confirmed. So you can pretty much take your conspiracy theory and you can find the credible ones have some kind of confirmation that this is how the system works. And so how do I interpret that? Well, I interpret that as effectively dismantling everything that propped up the dollar. And so to me, when you take on the deep state, when you reveal the deep state, nobody's going to be arrested. The system's still going to work as it is. The same transnational capital will control, these global geopolitical moves. But you effectively weaken the fabric of what made belief in the dollar globally and also internally. And so one thing you'll notice is that the trust in the system, it is an all-time low, and people don't trust any of the fabric that made, the empire. So to me, I believe that these releases were from the factions of power within the financial industrial complex at the highest level that is telling Department of Justice what they're able to release and what is unacceptable, but revealing how the system actually works. And I think that's strategically another financial weapon of mass destruction to push this world into this multipolar world. And it kind of coincides with my market analysis. That's what I think is happening here. Now, on that, there is obviously, lower down characters like Thomas Massey that brought the case forward, and then a bit of geopolitical theater on both the left and the right to get the case to pass. And then you have the judicial side making sure it actually happened. And then you have the theatrics of, Trump saying it's a Democratic hoax, everybody taking their narrative, we're the most transparent. And so it gives everyone the ability to feed the algorithms, push out all this information. And no one's going to really go to prison unless they're an asset that needed to be disposed of. But you've completely weakened the entire system that propped up the dollar and made America the global hegemon, and kind of exposed all these different types of constructs. You got to combine that with the fact that you've got USAID being dismantled. Now it will be replaced with something else that serves another agenda. But these were really where the covert operations happened. National Endowment of Democracy. This is where you would have the colored revolutions and you'd recruit these militia groups in order to overthrow governments and funnel the funds via USAID to prop up the covert operations and destabilization campaigns. You've got United Nations being bankrupted, deconstructed. United Nations was where the great powers and America primarily got to veto vote and basically control narrative. And so taking out United Nations, while it looks like MAGA, it looks like what you would say to achieve popularity, but actually it's deconstructing and weakening the dollar. And then you've got to combine that with all the central banking operations that we're seeing right now with all these financial flows.
And one of the things that we uncovered with the Epstein files was there was an email talk where Epstein, I believe, was talking about how Davos would be a worthy replacement of the UN. Where does that kind of fit in line with what you're seeing here as well? Are we deconstructing the UN, the global world order? Will Davos be the substitute to that?
Yeah, I think World Economic Forum and Davos is where business leaders communicate, in order to get the lower down people that aren't involved in the backdoor conversations to directionally move with where capital flows is sending. And there were several things that came out of Davos. You had this, you kind of had this move and a confirmation that we're in a multipolar world, which is like we're now arrived there. And that confirmation, you had the border peace, which to me is a construct that comes from the pillar of once, Palestine is liberated and the Greater Israel project is no longer expansive to destabilize the Middle East, then you've really set the regions. And also with the Russia-Ukraine side, once you take these big battles and also Iran, and you resolve those, which is what I think we're in, you've effectively broken up the sphere of influence. And the only thing that was stopping those wars previously was because the global hegemon benefits from war. War was a big part of the US stock pump. And so if you're going to be pulling back from those roles, handing it over to strategic partners at BRICS and the GCC, the Gulf Cooperation Council, then you need a organization to effectively allow the empire to look strong while it's shrinking to regional power. And then you have this ability to take all of the different negotiations that have been happening in this transition to multipolarity, put them through the border peace, and then say, we, the American empire, we're creating peace as it exits from these wars that were propping up the dollar before. And so, you got that. And then you had all the different arguments between, Europe kind of pushing towards China, which supports BRICS, another movement to multipolarity, Canada, pushing towards BRICS, but also the narrative that, America is strong. It's the bully. And so both narratives where Trump is saying, we are strong, we took Venezuela, we're going to take oil from Iran. You got strength on the one side of the narrative. And then on the other side, they're saying America's the bully, but America's still strong. So it's pushing this show strength while you shrink to regional power. And Davos are definitely, the leaders at Davos are definitely, running the show here and pushing this narrative towards multipolarity. Lots of conversation around energy, which is all the AI and robotics, and just really confirmation. And also the Pentagon published, its new security policy, which really confirmed this multipolar world. It de-emphasized, China as an adversary. It kind of pushed that Europe's not that important. It said that, Iran, Russia, North Korea, and China, they're no longer the major threats. We need to focus on internal policies and internal harmony and the Western Hemisphere. And so we've had the new security policy. We've had the United Nations deconstruction. We've had World Economic Forum, signal all of this stuff. And then we see the Epstein files that kind of discredits the system as long as the financial, the only central bank in the world that's increasing rates is the Bank of Japan. Break the Japan carry trade. NATO is draining all these petrodollars by escalating, the Russia war, continuing that narrative, America pretending they want peace when the military industrial complex wants to suck up all those euro dollars into the military stocks. Increase in the budget from $1 trillion to $1.5 trillion for military, just really rolling over, even regime changing the Federal Reserve in order to make sure that you're getting this massive budgets, massive fiscal dominance, weakening of the dollar and pumping of the US stock market. And of course, as the dollar weakens, that breaks the currency pegs, and it also means that even things like, we just got confirmation right now that much of the oil of Venezuela is being shipped and refined over in the Gulf countries, which is then being purchased by China. And so you can really see this transnational capital in all these operations.
Interesting. You mentioned that all this stuff was connected. The Epstein files, the metals market behaving the way it has over the last week or so, the nomination of Kevin Warsh. Let's go back and take it to the metals market. You mentioned that earlier in the dialogue. How is what's happening in the metals market connected to the Epstein file dump?
Yeah, well, what did we see? I'm not sure they're necessary. They're all part of a longer-term directional operation rather than the day-to-day minutia. But essentially, we had this massive, treasuries are being sold by foreign central banks. Domestic purchases of U.S. treasuries, at shorter and shorter rates. The long-term treasuries are not what's fulfilling most of the rollover. They're getting shorter and shorter duration in order to fulfill. And the demand for treasuries, it's still there. The bills, the shorter term duration, like we've had massive auctions, but they've been mainly domestic. It's been mainly, we've gone from QT to a little bit of QE. We saw some distress in banks as well, which is a bit suspicious. We should talk about. We also, are seeing these very large Cayman Island holdings, domestic holdings. But the point is that it's being rolled over domestically rather than via these foreign institutions. Now, the financial industrial complex is using that opportunity to take some of these foreign treasury holdings, sell their holdings, sell the dollar, buy their local currencies, invest it in their local bonds like JJBs in Japan, repatriate some of that capital. But we've had about another 4,500 tons added to central bank reserves outside the US. And that's not including what China's doing and all the stuff we don't know about. through the shell companies and stuff. But reported, we've had approximately, 4,500 tons of gold added to central bank and the central bank's balance sheet. And the percentage of foreign reserves in US Treasury is down to about 40% now. So the largest holding of foreign central bank reserves is gold, which officially marks the start of gold being the world reserve currency again. Not a currency, but a reserve asset, let's say. While all of these different fiat currency rails are being built. Now, I do think that some major bank, and we don't know who was on the wrong side of the trade yet in the silver short squeeze, that pumped the price of silver, like unbelievable volatility, unbelievable directionally upside and then back down. And, we're seeing wild swings in gold and silver through this transition.
$10 swings in a single day on the part of silver. Yesterday we were down at like 72, got up to 88. So that was like a $16 swing. But yeah, volatility has been ramping up. It's just going back and forth with the buyers and sellers.
Yeah, unprecedented. And also the arbitrage between the silver in China versus the rest of the world. So, the silver market with this structural deficit, because 60% is needed for industrial use, it is really becoming apparent, and we don't know who was on the wrong side of this trade. Whether it was a genuine industrial player that was using futures market to hedge the fact that it had such a pump, and then it pumped further and further and further, and then they weren't able to deliver in that time. Whether this is the financial industrial complex using, massive amounts of volatility to try and get more silver from somebody else, whether it's a large bank and institution that managed to get some of those Federal Reserve bailouts in the background, or whether they're just repositioning this hole over to some hedge fund. We don't know the story yet. We don't have transparency on it, but somebody is on the wrong side of this trade. And volatility seems to be the mechanism for trying to bankrupt somebody and make sure that the bank's balance sheet is okay. Because, the banks are going to reposition themselves if JP Morgan was on the wrong side of this trade. And even if they can't get on the right side of it, they'll still obviously do a bailout into fiscal dominance, socialize the losses, privatize the gains. So the banks are going to be fine. But there is something going on in silver, and we don't know what it is yet. And I think that silver, silver's a bit more difficult because it's an industrial trade. But gold, don't fall for this volatility. If you're getting these wild swings, I still think we've got a lot further to go in this trade. And remember, as the dollar weakens, you have these different psychological shifts around gold as a unit of account in people's minds. For example, our business, we've always dollarized our business because it's been on the strengthening trade. But that 15-year bullish gold outperforming other currencies is coming to an end. That trend is broken now. So immediately you start thinking about, okay, what are we going to do instead of dollarizing? And so you start looking at things like gold stable coins, or you start looking at how you can store your value in gold, but what are you going to hold your day-to-day payments in? And so immediately we look for something like a gold stable coin or something. We hold reserves in Bitcoin and stuff, but a gold stable coin. And then you go to your staff and you'll start saying, look, your currency is losing value to the dollar. Would you like to be paid in a gold stable coin? And of course they say yes. And so then people start thinking about, how do I price my goods in golds? And you start psychologically trying to think how things are valued in these different, commodities. And that takes a long time, because psychologically we understand value in terms of a currency. But these things are starting to have impact. And the longer and longer that you get these commodities, foreign currencies and foreign stocks outperforming US still pushing all the money printing into the markets, you get these psychological shifts that really change the game. So it's still a commodities game.
Yeah. Well, you make a great point. We've got people are beginning to shift their mindset from a fiat currency unit of account to a gold unit of account. One thing in particular is the markets. We like to think of the markets as being at an all-time high. Now, if you price the markets in gold terms, we've actually been crashing. The market's actually down 30+% priced in gold. Here's your S&P divided by gold. And this is logarithmic, but if you look at it from a linear scale, the last big top we had was in 2000. And we've been dipping lower since, around 2024, the beginning of 2024 here. Looks like it's from the top here, you're looking at a 50% drop in priced in gold terms.
Yeah, correct. And what you're also seeing is if you do the same for Bitcoin as well, it's become apparent that, in its current form, Bitcoin is not, following the gold trade of what people think it will do in these times of distress. The reason is because we haven't had a custody crisis yet. Like now with gold, everyone's finding it very clunky it's impossible to get physical, really, really hard at scale. And so we're at some stage going to have, a crisis in terms of paper contracts and custody, which is kind of like the Bitcoin story. But you'll notice that at the moment, Bitcoin seems to be a leading indicator for the AI and tech trade. And so what I think happened is the AI and tech side was dominating the indexes, and it was getting out of control. And it requires, with the exception of Google, the companies that can actually have the cash flows, most of the other companies like the ChatGPTs and the NVIDIAs and everyone, they're kind of playing this circle of contracts with each other. And they've created an environment where they have to raise unbelievable amounts of finance to continue that data center build out. This was causing a structural problem within private credit markets where it's predominantly being funding, and obviously private credit is a function of one's ability to borrow from the bank as well. And so while you're getting these longer term interest rates, that seem to be plateauing or going up, on the shorter side, they're still trying to get those rates down. And so this is what I think the regime change at the Federal Reserve is. They need to unlock the private credit market. That is, a function of the bank market at the other side of that. And they need that significantly invested into these AI data centers. And so this is causing a little bit of stress and problems. And so, that's why I think it was really, really important that the administration or there was an internal battle between, kind of the traditional orthodox banks versus how to get money into these data centers and the traditional asset management play. And so we had this battle. It was like, are we going to get, Rick Reeder from BlackRock, the chief investment officer? But instead, we got the Epstein boy that was on the Epstein files, Kevin Walsh. And I think, this is a commitment to get those rates down. And it's all about getting that money into these data centers to do the AI and robotics trade. Nothing stops that train. I know some people think that, but what we saw, I think, is a correction, a recognition that this is an energy and oil play, which had its impact on the commodity play. But now we've had this correction in AI and tech dominance and the Magnificent Seven. I think leading into the Fed regime change and the lower rate cycle is going to return back to dominance because these are geopolitically strategic. They'll blow the whole economy to try and make sure that this data center and energy build out happens because they're building this whole police state and surveillance state mechanism. And so I think Bitcoin is kind of following that right now, but it could become more like a gold story when we have a custody issue. And if we get any issues with like a force majeure or something where they cash settle any of these silver contracts, I think people are going to understand the importance of self-custody and the challenges of doing that at scale with some of these physical commodities.
What do we know about Kevin Warsh aside from the fact that he's present in the files? But we had an entire year of just Trump roasting Powell for not cutting rates, and now he brings in the guy who's supposedly one of the most hawkish nominees out there. And I tuned into the CNBC landing page. And, one of the big headlines that they had to explain the gold and silver crash last week was that it came as a result, or it was like somehow correlated with the nomination of Kevin Warsh, which is absolutely asinine on its face, as if one Fed governor can actually have that much impact. Not governor, but Fed chair could have that much impact on the metals complex. Because it wasn't just gold and silver. It was the entirety of the metals complex. And they've been moving in tandem for a while now. Even before the crash, you were starting to see lithium break out. You're starting to see nickel break out, rare earth metals break out, platinum break out. All these things were signaling that it was go time for a major run in commodities. The only laggard was energy. But energy has been fairly resilient even despite the crash here. We've still been we've been range bound 60 to 65 on WTI oil. But what do you anticipate with Kevin Warsh coming down as the new Fed head? And is this another head fake? Are they going to do a little switcheroo maybe before they actually get to the actual nomination?
Yeah, well, all to speculate on, really. I do know that we have set up the story, which is that interest rates need to come down. Nothing stops this train. I do believe that is the strategy. And at the last, FOMC or the Fed meeting, we had 8 votes that leave interest rates and 2 that were looking for jobs, cut rates, despite all the data kind of not really conforming to that narrative. And so, I do think this is kind of another attack on Fed independence, which strategically, again, weakens the dollar, but also pushes the fiscal dominance story. What becomes quite interesting here is that now that we've entered into, this very late phase debt cycle in the US, you really have all eyes and all attention on this cut rate significantly narrative. And if you don't follow that, then we're going to have, real rampant speculation around mismanagement of expectations. So I think it plays into a volatility play. I personally, if I were to speculate, I think he's there to cut the rates when the data doesn't match. But also at the same time, strategically, the Fed can decide to go against what he's supposed to do. And that will have a real big impact in some of these capital outflow operations. So I think, again, it's a checkmate for the financial industrial complex to have a compliant Fed chair that will kind of optimize based upon bank policy and what is needed in managing this transition to multipolarity.
And what if the 10 and 30 don't respond in accordance to their cutting of the Fed funds rate? Will they just monetize the debt at that point? Will they go that far?
Well, I think it's all about monetization and pushing towards QE. Nothing stops this train. You got to print the money. I don't know any other strategy. Is sacrifice the dollar, print the money, roll over on the short term, and then if inflate away the debt is the only strategy from here. And if the bond market doesn't like it, then you can utilize that to manage these massive capital outflows and push the world into this multipolarity. And I do think that that even you can connect that to the border peace. The border peace is, we know that all the deals have kind of been negotiated between the world powers. Who's going to take over the key ports? Who's going to take over the key routes? What does the oil flows and gas flows look like? All the world leaders, knowing where we're going, have negotiated all of that. And anytime they want to make the announcement, they can kind of say, well, Trump was forcing us in order to get to world peace, and here's the announcement. And then, and then you can combine that with finance being able to reposition and front run those capital outflow positions, or dump some of their positions accordingly, while the border peace is the mechanism for doing the announcement. And I think, again, Trump is fully aligned with transnational capital and global finance more than any other faction of power.
Interesting. Who's been buying the debt up until this point? Because it's not Japan. China's out. Who's been buying? Who's been keeping the 10-year yield at, range bound at 4.2, 4.3% now for like 3 years now?
Yeah, well, it's, you don't get full transparency on it, but we do know that Cayman Islands holding seems to continually be increasing, which I think is domestic and internal, and transnational capital. Look, they don't want to lose treasuries as their, as their collateral. This is something they still want to manage, but at the same time, they're hedging their global markets as well. And so, the foreign central banks aren't buying. And I think this is all around the deregulation of 401ks to make sure that some of those lower interest rate, shorter term bills can be put through these 401ks. You got Cayman Island, which is, we don't know exactly what's happening here. But the buyers of last resort before the Federal Reserve, they seem to be sucking up some of these auctions as well, the discount brokers. But in the end, we know who the final buyer is. It's the Fed.
Yeah. Well, let's go ahead and take it geopolitically. You mentioned the Board of Peace, and now there seems to be a return of negotiations between Iran and the United States. Now, I know, people sometimes have short-term memories, but I remember the last time Iran and the U.S. were negotiating. It was right before the 12-day war. What do you make of these new developments coming out of the U.S.-Iran relationship? Are they just waiting for the carrier strike groups to get into place? Is this a legitimate, honest-to-God negotiation, or is there something else at play here?
Yeah, so it's important to break it down into a bit more nuance. My interpretation of the situation, and you're quite right, if you look at the last 12-day war, you had this narrative around Trump was posting on Truth Social, we're in negotiations. You had the reform within Iran, you have IRGC, which would be associated with the more military hardliners, and many of the theological, like the more religious type of narrative that's pushed out about Shia expansionism and Islamist sponsors of terrorists and all that type of stuff. Those narratives, which we know is a Western operation now from the Epstein files, and we know from Iran-Contra affair that there's more cooperation between US hardliners in Iran and Israel as well. That strategic tension between Iran and Israel made the military-industrial complex a lot of money, and destabilized the region. So you have those hardliners, and if you remember, there was a negotiation between the Reform Party. The helicopter came down, the previous president was taken out, and we had this reformist faction. Now, I believe they are fully aligned with China, and China at the moment is negotiating with America, or at least the financial industrial complex, and they're all co-investing via these sovereign wealth funds. So that transnational capital of American finance, sovereign wealth funds, and China are fully aligned. Now, what happened last time is that you have, and that's aligned with the reform side of Iran, which then has the more IRGC side, which is the narrative. What they were doing is Trump set up a narrative from negotiations. And so the negotiations were, all right, you're not allowed a nuclear program. And so there was this whole debate around, do we do it at 2%, 60%, 90%? And so they were debating around the nuclear enrichment. Iran agreed that they would reduce their nuclear enrichment, and they had essentially a deal. And then suddenly Steve Witkoff came out and changed the terms and said, you can't have any ballistic missiles, and you can only enrich uranium to 2%. And so what it did is it created the narrative in the media, war on, war off, war on, war off. And then suddenly you had a preemptive strike from Israel. Israel took out some of the generals and the nuclear scientists and various hardliners. And then Iran, for the first time, responded with, large aggression. And that took out some of the Mossad assets. It took out, within Israel, it was illegal for you to film and post any videos, and you'd get arrested. But there was, for the first time, America allowed Iran to do significant damage within Israel. Their debt to GDP went up to like 70%. They had to close their port. They got downgraded by all of the credit rating agencies. Even later, then you started seeing deals between Israel and Egypt to create strategic dependencies. UAE started investing in the aerospace industry, acquiring more of the assets. And so essentially, you've got this vassalization strategy within Israel to essentially make dependencies upon its neighbors. Now, within the IRGC side, you had many of the hardliners taken out. And then America got to show strength and say they came over with the B-52 bomber. Now, the nuclear, you could see, even in the hash power with Bitcoin mining, we had this massive drop right before the bomb dropped. And we also had these satellite images that they were moving parts of their nuclear program. But the B-52 bomber came, and then we had this massive AI footage in America saying we took out the program. Now, they did do some damage, but it definitely didn't take out the program. So then we had Israel basically drained all of its defense. Iran demonstrated that for the first time, you can actually, take on Israel more aggressively. And then America got to say, we took out the nuclear program. So after 12 days, they all took a victory lap and everybody said they won. So to me, and then it ended when we had this strategic strike from Iran on Qatar, and then it led to, Qatar intervening and everything quietened down. But what they tend to do before these operations is set up the narrative for on-off. So there it was, nuclear enrichment. Now what they did is they did an Operation Ajax 2.0. If you haven't read, you can go and check out Operation Ajax. It's essentially where you create, Scott Bessent came out and said that he did a currency war. So he destroyed the currency. All of the savings of the average Iranian was wiped out. You then had this inflation that had a big spike while the currency was weakening. That was a Scott Bessent hedge fund, financial industrial complex intervention. That led to the normal protests based upon economic circumstance from the different markets that could no longer trade because of this inflation. Obviously, the distress was caused from the sanctions previously to put it in this position. And then you had an infiltration by Mossad, very similar to Operation Ajax. If you look at Operation Ajax 1, that was when CIA and MI6 basically took over the media, started manufacturing violence, started shooting at the leadership in order to lead to a regime change. And then they could take over the oil because they were, at that time, it was about British petroleum. We had the exact same operation. Now, we had all of the different media really pushed in order to create this narrative. Okay, so you are asking people to come up against the military, the IRGC, which are a ruthless military. And all the media was pushing people to start standing up against them. Now, we know from operations like in Syria that the only time you get the regime change is when the army is on board to meet the revolutionaries and world powers have already said that it's okay and Assad will be regime changed. In this case, IRGC weren't on board in that. So the media was pushing people to rise. There was no military support. You were asking people to come against the military. That's never going to work. Revolutions only happen when the revolutionaries join the military change sides, and then you coup the regime. And so that led to a massive amount of, of what the media was saying as deaths. Now, Iran said there was about 3,000. The media was saying 50,000, like 30,000, 100,000. And then you had all these people saying, it's genocide and all of that type of stuff. So it was very, very similar to Operation Ajax. And so we saw that again. But it created the narrative that Trump needs, which was they're killing people. Oh, they agreed not to kill people. They're killing people. Oh, they agreed not to kill people. And so that's what you need in the negotiation. They set up the narrative. And now we're getting that Trump will post, yes, Iran, IRGC said they won't do it anymore. So that led into this. And then we got this ambiguity because things are going back and forth. What I think this operation is a continuation of the 12-day war, which is the world leaders, including the reform elements of Iran, have agreed that Iran is going to be vassalized into China. Because effectively, Iran is economically 100% dependent on China buying its oil right now. If China stops buying its oil, then Iran will have serious, serious problems. And so they have created this dependency, and China has been leveraging with the Reform Party and then negotiating with the Gulf Cooperation Council, the GCC, who are aligned with the American financial industrial complex, to vassalize and economically vassalize Israel into the GCC. Then eventually American military will stop supporting it. And Palestine and Israel will eventually be kind of normalized into the GCC. That's what I think the operation that transnational capital is negotiated and are trying to execute right now. That requires the purge of the militias, which I think is hardliner IRGC, which is if there's another tit for tat, it's because essentially I think the reformists are outsourcing to Mossad and America to take out some of the hardliner IRGCs. I don't think Khomeini is going to be taken out. We'll see. I don't think that needs to happen or will happen. And at the same time, you need to de-radicalize the Zionists, and you need to de-radicalize the Jewish Zionists in Israel and the Christian Zionists in America, which is, to me, what the result of the Jeffrey Epstein files does. It connects these operations to pedophilia and sex trafficking, so that the Christian Zionists need to ask themselves, am I okay with this? Essentially, it's starting to defang some of these radical Zionists, some of these covert operations, and in the mind of the average American, recognizing this is completely illegitimate and immoral. And so I think I see the connection between these different types of operations and the transition. And it's a messy operation. This is decades and decades. But what we're seeing around the Middle East is the purging of all the hardliners across all the different region and the elimination of proxies and replacing with real standing armies. So you got a normalization between Pakistan, Turkey, and Saudi Arabia. And Turkey's a real army, Egypt as well. So you're now starting to see these allegiances between UAE and India, while Pakistan, China, are having these allegiances. So everything's pointing to me, proxies are coming to an end, and these are kind of the final operation. And I'm not sure how long it will take, but again, nothing stops this train. Effectively, Iran is going to be in the Chinese BRICS sphere of influence, which is why Iran joined BRICS, and Israel is going to be in the GCC sphere of influence. And then maybe this is just to take out some of the American military bases as agreed by all regional parties. We'll see. I'm not sure what it's going to be, but I do think the outcome is that this is an effective transitional exit of America from the Middle East and replacing destabilization campaigns with genuine defense contracts and real regional stability.
What do you make of this notion that some are saying that the Epstein files were released on Friday? No coincidence being that we've been on the verge of an Iran strike now for a couple of weeks now. The strike groups are getting into place and all this stuff. What do you make of this idea that the Epstein files were used as a pressure tactic to get Trump to take action on Iran? Because they did withhold half the files. They still have, they released 3 million. There's another 3 million that they haven't released yet. And some people are saying it's a mechanism to pressure Trump to pull the trigger on Iran. And then there's other groups of people that are saying that it's the opposite. It's Trump released the files to back the war hawks off. So I
think both narratives are cartoon narratives. I think there is a cartoon narrative that Israel rules the world and that Mossad is in charge of everything and that Netanyahu is the leader of everything. There is an alternative narrative that Iran's the resistance, and that's one. And then another narrative is Trump is taking down the deep state and taking on Israel. All of those are cartoons. The real narrative from following the money and looking at what's happening with like oil routes, investment contracts, border peace, different negotiations, normalizations. If you follow all of that doesn't make headlines because it's not sexy and it's not interesting and it's not sponsored by narrative through propaganda, you'll I think come to the conclusion that transnational capital controls the Epstein files. Both Netanyahu and Trump are subordinate. And the way that these operations, I think it's worth taking a bit of time to understand what these operations are. Because I think people think that this is like, oh, Mossad controls the Epstein files and they're using it to blackmail America. And then AIPAC controls all the politicians. That was a deliberate reveal, I believe, in order to eventually, and this isn't Trump playing 5D chess. Trump is subordinate to this power structure. So what are the Epstein files? There's not a chance in hell that a person called Jeffrey Epstein knew that levels of people and can connect to that many people globally of importance. Not possible. There's also no chance that he was just somebody he was sick and twisted. That's completely true. But he wasn't just somebody that was involved in sex trafficking. This is a demonstration of how power really works in the real world, which is that the higher you want to go in power, the more compromised you have to be. And so what Jeffrey Epstein is a compromised network for real power. It's how you control governments. It's how you control leaders. It's how you control technical executives of tech companies, executives of military companies. It's how you have leverage within the deep state, the intelligence apparatus. So Jeffrey Epstein was constructed and manufactured. He wasn't a genius financier at Bear Stearns that became a billionaire. He was implanted into Bear Stearns. He wasn't somebody that was incredibly wealthy managing a family office. He was managing the family office of Lex Wexner, which is deep state money from black operations. And he was manufactured from forces that have hundreds of years of connections. This isn't somebody that, he was manufactured. And there were more Jeffrey Epsteins. And what it is if you, for example, want to be introduced to Donald Trump via Jeffrey Epstein, then you have to be compromised in order to get the introduction. And so his job was to take all of these networks and basically compromise people so that they could get introductions. And the idea is that the higher you want to go, if you want Donald Trump's role, then you have to be more and more degenerate unless you have leverage over the network. And so Trump, for example, he has leverage over the network to a certain degree because he's got a cult following that will forgive him for anything. Anything could come out and they'll say, no, he's playing 5D chess. So that gives him a little bit of leverage and uniqueness in negotiating against the compromise network. But the compromise network is in charge here, and so that's how these Epstein files work. And if you want to go to the highest level, then they need you to be involved in photos and videos of demonic cult rituals, or even sacrificing your first child. Depends how high you want to go in power. And at the highest in power are the most compromised. Starts with a little bit of investment and financial transactions. That creates a dependency. Once you have a financial dependency, then you start, then you ask for more contacts. And as you get more contacts, you have to be more and more compromised until you're something at the top of the chain. And it's a mafia. You're not like some people ask, well, once you got $1 billion, who cares about 10 billion? No. Once you're in the network, you have to keep providing value to the network, and you have to keep being compromised further. And if you try and exit the network, then you get Michael Jackson. You're told you're a file, you get smear campaigns in media, and you get taken out if you need to be. And so you can use assassinations, reputational damage, child sex trafficking, all these different degenerate behaviors in order to stop people leaving the network. And that's how power works. And that's what Jeffrey Epstein was. And Jeffrey Epstein himself was no longer useful. So they took him out. Some people think he's still alive. I don't think so. Because he's just not that useful an asset. He's just one of many. And this is not deconstructing the power structure. It's revealing the power structure that backed up the dollar. And that was the strategic route, but it doesn't expose transnational capital. Those are the important things. It's what's not in there that's important, and what is the impact of revealing all this stuff. And then some of the assets may get taken out. The royal family in UK, some of the different things that we've seen, but it's not designed to end the network. It's designed to still be a blackmail ring. So 50% is behind. Some people believe that that's all Israel and Mossad. I think that's a bit of theatrics. I think Israel and Mossad are blackmailed by the same, just as UK is, just as EU is, just as America is. And so, what is the real utility of this? Well, this is telling the world we are moving to multipolarity. Everybody get on track. We'll reveal a bunch of stuff that weakens the dollar, reveals this, puts to rest some of these narratives, but everyone remain on track because we got the real stuff up here still, and that's still there. And Trump, I don't believe Trump controls it or the DOJ controls it.
So, there was a period back in like the 1800s, 1700s, or like secret societies were super prevalent. Like it was actually pretty common to have a secret society. That was like during the time of the Enlightenment, and you're escaping, the Catholic Church's power. So they had to like embed their teachings and their ideology and symbolism. So like secret societies were awash in the world. But
yeah, we saw more of that in the Epstein files. I'm sure, look, we can't even begin the surface. This is going to create content for years and years to come, like to get through all this stuff. But some of the things that touched my desk, I saw there was a contract where, the current Rothschilds were paying Jeffrey Epstein $25 million in algorithmic and technical software consulting. That kind of makes a connection between Rothschild power networks. There were emails around connecting, what else did I see? Oh, the Vatican Bank. So it revealed some of the things we know about the Vatican Bank. That was, the Vatican has always been used in order to do some of these. They get a cut because it's the Vatican Bank is not connected to European, Bank Secrecy Act compliance rules. And so all of the black op operations, the CIA, the Mossad, the MI6 funding, that was always done via Vatican Bank and its network. And the Vatican would get like a cut of all the different transactions, from sex trafficking, human trafficking, weapons trafficking, drugs trafficking. Some of those connections were revealed in different emails while Jeffrey Epstein was talking about these different things. There was, as I said, the whole militias and ISIS, Al Qaeda being connected to Western intelligence. There is so much that was revealed around these older networks. There was also confirmation that Hitler was hosted by Rothschild families.
And the Epstein family, too. They mentioned the Epstein family, the Rothschild family, and there's one other family that was involved.
Yeah. And again, I'm not doing a good job right now, so please do fact check this all in the comments and stuff. But I put out a bunch of the things that I thought was most interesting. Look, this is just emails. This could also be red herrings. We don't know any of this. But this is the fog of information that we're in right now as we are making these major transitions. But I would say, the things that I've always talked about that people would traditionally say are conspiracy theories, I've got way more confirmation and conviction around 90% of all the things that I understand around how the world really works and who rules the world. And almost all of it was confirmed. Maybe I've got some confirmation bias here, but almost all of it was confirmed with different things that I've seen within this Epstein file drop so far.
Yeah. So I kind of feel the same way as well, but it has vindicated a lot of us throughout the years who have been studying this stuff, covert politics, secret societies, all this other jazz. Anything else you want to talk about, Simon, before we take this thing home, or did we cover everything?
One subject I've got to talk about was Bitcoin and the Epstein files. So it's very clear that so Bitcoin was a white paper in 2008. My belief is that it came from DigiCash, which was a project by David Chom, and they got taken out by, for being centralized. And I believe from that, they created an open source version. And I personally believe Satoshi was Len Sassaman and also Hal Finney. There was a white paper in 2008. The code was released in 2009. Gavin Andreessen was one of the first Bitcoin developers, and there were other Bitcoin developers. And then round about 2011, it was confirmed, and I got confirmation by Amir Taki, that Jeffrey Epstein was trying to figure out who's the who in Bitcoin. And so that implies to me it wasn't created by Jeffrey Epstein, clearly, the evidence points towards, which is what some people are saying. But in round about 2011, he did start putting out the feeders and start trying to invest in privacy coins. So Amir Taki was the person that invited me to the first Bitcoin conference in 2011. And he was working on a project called Darkcoin, and a privacy coin that later became known as Dash and various other things. And so it looked like Jeffrey Epstein was trying to fund privacy coins and tapping up the who's who in Bitcoin development. Now, we also saw that in 2014, there was a conversation between Peter Thiel and Jeffrey Epstein talking about how to discredit Bitcoin, and talking about things like stable coins and those types of things. This is around about 2014. At this time, this is when the Bitcoin Foundation that was funding Bitcoin developers through a conglomerate of important Bitcoin companies at the time, you can see that he started to try and invest in these different companies. And Peter Thiel and Jeffrey Epstein, there were various investments. Jeffrey Epstein invested in Coinbase, in the early rounds, and also invested in Blockstream, which is essentially a company that spun off from some of the Bitcoin core developers. And what we saw here is that you had the Bitcoin Foundation, and then you had a spin-off called Blockstream. Jeffrey Epstein funded that. And then you had Brock Pierce implanted, who has a very shady history with child sex allegations and various other things. He was inserted into the Bitcoin community, and he was the one that brokered Jeffrey Epstein's investment in Coinbase. He also created a company that was a dollar-backed stablecoin called Realcoin that later was rebranded when it was sold to a company called Bitfinex to Tether. And so I think it's very clear that Jeffrey Epstein wanted to infiltrate developers within Bitcoin. He also wanted to infiltrate the creation of stable coins. And he also wanted to invest in privacy coins. He went on to invest in Zcash, which is a private version of Bitcoin. He was looking at these Darkcoin at the time, from what I can tell. Again, this is all just me piecing together information with things that I remember from being involved in the early days of Bitcoin. And clearly, my long-term thesis is, why would this open source version of DigiCash that became Bitcoin, why would it be released? Now, there's no backdoor because it's a decentralized network of supercomputers. The code is open source. You have Bitcoin improvement proposals. Anybody can contribute to the code, and you have to get consensus, and anyone can run a node. And if you don't like that version, you can run a competing, so the infrastructure isn't tarnished. But there were attempts to try and infiltrate parts of the infrastructure. Now, why would it be open source? To me, it was always the theory that made the most sense was that it is to create a gateway drug for a central bank digital currency. And so what we saw next is that he started, the Bitcoin Foundation was discredited. We had arrests from some of the members. We had other members that are now being done for tax evasion. We had Brock Pierce implanted, and he also met Jeffrey Epstein. And so we then saw that the Bitcoin Foundation was discredited and bankrupted. And then Jeffrey Epstein invested in MIT University lab, like an innovation lab that had a spun-off called Digital Currency Initiative that then funded 3 of the Bitcoin developers. And so then you had this email communications back and forth confirming that. But eventually, what did DCI do? It ended up creating a lab for central bank digital currencies. And then Brock Pierce created Tether, a stable coin. And then Jeffrey Epstein invested in privacy coins. And then Blockstream received funding from Jeffrey Epstein that later Adam Back, allegedly, who was the CEO of Blockstream, he came out on X and said that they divested. But what did Blockstream, and if you look at Adam Back and his history, started as a cypherpunk, was involved in many, many Bitcoin debates around future codes. He didn't control the whole narrative, but influenced certain aspects. And now he promotes Bitcoin treasury companies, is working with Howard Lutnick, who was also in the Jeffrey Epstein side, many, many mentions. He created all this, Cantor Fitzgerald, which was creating all these Bitcoin treasury companies. We also had implications from Gary Gensler, who was chair of the SEC when we had Operation Choke Point 2.0. And so everything you're seeing right now with Bitcoin treasury companies, stable coins, crypto capital, all the things that aren't Bitcoin in self-custody were, I think, clear operations in order to centralize as much Bitcoin as possible and also influence the code in different factions. Also, I remember Brock Pierce. I was at a conference once and he tried to persuade me that Satoshi Nakamoto was Craig Wright. It was Gavin Andreessen, who was one of the coders that was funded, that then went out and said that Satoshi Nakamoto, he has cryptographic proof that the Satoshi wallets are owned by Dr. Craig Wright, which turned out to be completely false in the end. And so when you look at that, I think Bitcoin Cash was also a psyop to try and fork the code and control the code in a more centralized structure. And Blockstream was a mechanism for influencing what they could in the decentralized network. And then Brock Pierce was a mechanism for creating a stable coin that is now turning into, through the Genius Act and Clarity Act, the surveillance state Orwellian nightmare, connected to Peter Thiel, who was originally trying to do the destabilization campaigns, and also Elon Musk, who lied about the fact that he was actually requesting to bring his wife to Epstein Island. And Adam Back also, there was confirmation that travel was arranged for him to go to one of the islands to meet Jeffrey Epstein. So all this to say is that most people are getting the narrative completely wrong because they're going for the easy narrative. The reality is this had multiple attack vectors. There was emails around trying to compromise Michael Saylor, who's centralizing a bunch of Bitcoin into Wall Street. All of this to say is that, to me, the decentralized nature of Bitcoin survived all these attack vectors, but we have lots of exposing to do to try and make sure that we get out all of the compromised elements of it and make sure that it still maintains its consensus. But people are just going for the easy narrative that Bitcoin means you're supporting pedophiles and you're involved side and you're a Mossad agent. See through that. They want you to sell your Bitcoin. They want you to centralize your Bitcoin. They want to try and influence parts of the infrastructure, but it's still the most decentralized thing that we actually have. And if in doubt, I think we still got, if you can put gold in self-custody, there are operations around what Bitcoin is. But I still think this is a fixed asset, multipolar world transition. And we're going to learn a lot more. But I think it proved its fragility to these attack vectors.
Wow. It's all the data dump when I'm talking to you, Simon. I can't help but just sit there and listen. But thank you so much for your time, my friend. And guys, I'd like to remind you, this episode is probably going to get squashed by the algorithm because of all the stuff we talked about. So please help and do your part. Hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, hit the bell notification, comment down below. Do whatever you can to raise the engagement on this video, because I know for damn sure they're going to try and squash this video, considering all of the things that we touched on here. Simon, thank you so much for coming on, my friend. Where can people find you if they want to see more of your work?
I'm giving live updates in real time on X at Simon Dixon Twits. I'm sure you'll put the link in the description. And then I'm synthesizing all the data into everything that's happening in. Okay, all right. So that was a bit of a marathon. I hope you enjoyed those 2 interviews. I do want to put some disclaimers out there. This was incredibly difficult because I was giving updates in real time as the emails were released. And I've been at it like just 24/7 for the last week or so. And so any information that is inaccurate, do let me know in the comments section. I am very aware that we are dealing with people's reputations and this is going to upset a lot of people. So I do want to put anything that I got wrong right. I believe that everything I'm sharing is sharing in good faith. There is, circumstantial. This is not, it's innocent until proven guilty. No one's been proven of these crimes in court. These are all allegations. This is all file drops, and we're all trying to share the truth as well. I want to be careful with my language. I do think at times I might say something that doesn't come across in the right way, and I want to try and correct that as well. I'm just doing the best that I can to reveal the information, and my job here is only to ruin the reputations that need to be ruined, and share the information from people that respond to it. Because there is one thing that is way more important than all of us humans, us entities, and that is that we maintain the integrity of Bitcoin as a mechanism for owning our own money, spending our own money, and having a monetary policy that can't be infiltrated and can't be changed. That is my goal in all of this. So I'm doing the best that I can. I appreciate any feedback in the comment section, and I will keep at this. There is an incredible amount of data for us to get to. I do feel vindicated to some degree that many of the things that over the years people would ridicule me for, people would violently oppose, people would call you anti-Semitic, people would call you anything they could call you just to shut you up and discredit you in any way possible. Again, I did put at the beginning of this, I think I was a bit unjust in my characterization of the way that I described Amir Taki. I think I should have just stuck to factual accuracies. He has responded, and I've put my reply. I will try to correct anything that's inaccurate. He did confirm. I can't confirm. I have no way of doing it. But he confirmed that he didn't receive any funding from Jeffrey Epstein. He took offense to me characterizing him as a weird anarchist that's on drugs. That is accurate, that he did used to publicly do TV documentaries and represent the face of Bitcoin while under the influence. I think he says that these are things that are in the past and he shouldn't be held accountable to it forever, which is, true. The fact that he did go and fight ISIS is a Western intelligence criminal organization that is awful and commits crimes against humanity. And anybody that put themselves up for all the problems that can come from that in order to go and fight ISIS is not something that I wanted to represent as a bad thing. That is an honorable activity. He also said that the post that he put on Bitcoin Forum around the price of women for Bitcoin, he says that that's a joke. I think he's paying the price for that. I don't know whether that was real, whether that was a joke, but that's what he said to me. The reason that I am in Bitcoin today is because he organized one of the first Bitcoin conferences in the world, and he invited me to that conference. And so, again, these are just the facts. These are the realities. I am at a stage in my life where I will never put my reputation on the line in order to vouch for anybody, because I've done that throughout my career, and it's come back to bite me on multiple occasions. The only reason I am but a flawed human being that has made many mistakes, and my experience all comes from the vast amount of mistakes that I've made and the things that I've been exposed to, and my understanding of the world based upon the information from working in banking, becoming an investor, going deep in debt, achieving financial security that I never imagined was possible, being in business, investing in multiple companies, selling a business, and just all the different things that I've been thrown, that life has thrown at me. At the end of the day, there is only one plan, and that is the divine plan of God. I'm here to serve humanity, fight oppression wherever I can. And where I make mistakes, please do forgive me, and I will try and correct those mistakes. But throughout my life, by following the money, I have found that it's kind of got me ahead of trends by several years, when most people are following the media, listening to politicians, and the world is darker than we thought. And so what do we do with that information? Well, my best thinking at this stage right now is that life is a test, and we're never going to fix the world of evil. In fact, we can't even understand good without evil. Evil is needed in order to understand good. And so with that, we are going to be thrown very tempting decisions throughout our life. And we either go down a wrong path or we go down a better path, and we choose between good and evil. For me personally, the definition of what's good and what is evil is defined in divine scripture, the Quran. I know other people have different beliefs and different sets, but that allows me to distinguish between what is good, what is bad, what is evil, what is not evil. And so for me, I will continue to, fight this test. And I think it's in our moments when we are presented with evil, do we succumb to temptation? Do we understand what the right actions are, and recognizing that we are all flawed human beings? And even in compromised networks, don't put yourself in a position. I am eternally grateful that throughout my career, I knew what it would be required to make it in investment banking, and I decided to leave when I was invited to such degeneracy. And, I've made lots of mistakes in my life, but we learn more and more and more. And I've been blessed that even when being faced with the opportunity to rise in these circles, as an investor in these companies, something guided me. And that guidance meant that I didn't accept the invitation to some of these Brock Pierce parties in Puerto Rico and various other things. And something guided me at the right time. But I've also been very dumb and influential at very earlier stages of my life. And we should all have the opportunity to correct those mistakes or anything that comes from that. And these are very covert operations to compromise people. And I don't want to, I don't know how to communicate that in the best way possible. I decided that the right thing for me was to sell the operating part of my business to Coinbase. I didn't know what Coinbase was when I originally invested in it. I don't know what it is today. I do know that when you go further and further up the chain into the financial industrial complex, you become so far removed from what you originally wanted to create, because finance is a mechanism for turning us all into debt slaves, equity slaves, venture capital slaves, private equity slaves. And the higher you go up, the more compromised you have to become. And if there's one thing that I've learned as well, once you're in the mafia, you can't exit the mafia. The best way to stay away from it is to not become a part of it at the lower level, because these are gateway drugs to drive you harder, higher and higher up. And you can see the further and further and more powerful you become, you might find yourself on the wrong side of one of these operations, because Jeffrey Epstein is just one of many. And the fact that Bitcoin allowed me to remain sovereign, and the fact that Bitcoin allowed my business not to take Silicon Valley money, and the fact that we decided when was the right time, to not go public, to go public, and what the consequences of all these decisions are, for me, it's been a lifetime lesson. This is my thoughts and just the random things, because the worst thing of all of this is we're entering into a world where none of us can trust each other, and trust has been broken. It's being broken. And when we enter into a world where no one trusts each other, no one trusts what they see, no one knows if anything's real, soon people are going to be creating videos of me, and you're not going to know whether it's me or somebody else with all these deep fakes. And people are going to be committing crimes against humanity and then saying it wasn't me, it was AI. Like, we're entering into this world, and these are psychological operations, and nothing stops this train. And so what are we going to do in a world where you can't trust anything? Well, Bitcoin was kind of created at its essence so that you don't need to trust Coinbase. So you don't need to trust Blockstream. So you don't need to trust Adam Back. So you don't need to trust Brock Pierce. It's maths and code. And the closer you get to self-custody and running nodes, the further you are from anything that requires trust. And we're never going to get this thing perfect. But I sure as hell going to try and share the journey as I discover my best thinking and my worst thinking. And that's all I've ever tried to do. And that's all I've ever done. And so don't trust, verify. Don't idol worship, because these idols are the very same people that are compromising and propping up a network that may actually lead to the trafficking of your children. And if there is one thing that we're meant to be on this earth to do, is just not do to our children what they are doing in Gaza, and not do to our children what Jeffrey Epstein propped up, and recognize that that's what fiat currency is propped up by. The proof of weapons network is what I've tried to expose. And the more I learn, when my father asked me that question 25 years ago, when his entire lifetime savings was wiped out in the dot-com boom and bust, and he asked me, son, what happened to my money? I never imagined that the answer would be what we've discovered and what we're discovering here today. But without darkness, there can't be light. And so what we have to do is we have to shed light on darkness, and we have to be brave, and we have to tell the truth, because the truth is all that matters. And sometimes you may think something's the truth and it turns out not to be the truth later. And the limitations of linguistics and language, maybe I offend some people, but I'm here to just do the best that I possibly can. So look after yourself financially, spiritually, wealth. Look after your community. Look after your family, because that's what's needed. The further and further you go out, sovereign wealth, sovereign individuals, sovereign companies, sovereign countries, but the further and further you go out, the more you realize you can't trust. Because the one thing that I've learned right now is that trust doesn't scale. But Bitcoin created a trustless network. And look what they tried to do to it. They tried to compromise it at every level possible. And when we follow the money, eventually the truth prevails. And that's what I think we are doing here at Simon Dixon Hard Talk. And so always remember, you are alive at one of the most interesting, crazy, and exciting times in financial history. By understanding the truth, no matter how dark it may be, hopefully we can make better decisions. Because if there's one thing that I do know, when you don't understand how the system works, you can't make the right type of decisions. And that's why it's so easy to fool so many. Now, in this transition that we're going through right now, many are going to get hurt and some are going to do really well. I want to be around as many people that do well, and I want to make sure that we're doing as well for as many people as possible. So if you enjoyed this, please do share, please do like, please do retweet. I'll be going live on X whenever I can on Spaces, and I'll keep publishing. I did several more interviews. I know that I'm overwhelming people with information. I'll keep publishing those interviews, and I'll keep being challenged to come up with better thinking. Hopefully we can make this transition with peace, love, and unity in our side, but the vast majority won't. And that's reality. If you didn't see it, I did a little bit of a debate with Jeff Booth, where I've come to terms with that, we're not entering into this utopia. Bitcoin's not going to change human nature. And many people are attached too much to Bitcoin. Bitcoin allows you, I think it brings out your good and your evil. It's kind of like alcohol or drugs. Some people use drugs in order to bring out, their best thinking. Others use it to commit major crimes against humanity. I stay away from all of that stuff for now. And I never want to go into any of these things that can drive out these compromised networks. Because half of this stuff is what we're learning is that they will weaponize it. They will utilize it. And we need to remain vigilant. And we are but flawed humans. And That's all I've got to say to you, I think, in this moment. So I hope you enjoyed the show. I will see you this time next week for Simon Dixon Hard Talk. And please do make sure you are a subscriber of the channel on YouTube. Head over to Rumble to follow me over there in case this gets taken out. I'll stream it over on X as well. And make sure that you're on the newsletter at least and have a free membership portal. We're trying to rebrand bits of the website, but you can join, and there's a membership portal at SimonDixon.com, and I'll make sure I back up everything onto those blogs in case we need to move to that type of infrastructure. And I'm also exploring more of the decentralized social networks. I'm on Primal, Noster, and I'll try and repost over there. So let's share this journey together. And I will see you this time next week. Peace.